A totally tax-free £50,000 in cash could make you feel alive in 2025. And just one entry into the Great British Giveaway really could make £50,000 cash all yours. For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. You can call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB10 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 31st of January. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I'm Nana Acquia. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
The way in which children are being driven online because we're not taking them seriously offline. And what we're tending to do is seeing the problems entirely on the social media, forgetting the fact that we've given up on children being able to work independently and play independently outdoors. We've basically created a world where the digital bedroom has become this go-to area for a lot of young kids. We've given up on old-fashioned parenting, where we try to cultivate their resilience. And now we blame everything, all the problems that occur online. You have to remember that if you take something like bullying, bullying doesn't have to only take place online. It happens all the time, offline, in everyday life. But yet we only see the problem on the social media. And there's this obsession with the social media where every single problem that afflicts childhood is blamed on it. And that distracts us from actually understanding what we're doing wrong with children. So for me, and I hate when I see children with digital technology, when I see them with smartphones. I'm not a fan. I'm much more concerned about the fact that parents use their digital phones when they're having dinner with their kids and giving very bad examples in relation to that. But the real problem, it seems to me, is offline, and that's why we've got to crack the issue. So for me, the banning issue is entirely a headline-grabbing political gambit. And I think that we should be much more focused on the real problems rather than delude ourselves that anything will improve.
GB News, the People's Channel.
A very, very good afternoon to you. It's 3 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show here on GB News. We're broadcasting for you live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK. On today's show, GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters interviews Marlon, a dad from Rochdale. For 2 years, his daughter Scarlett, then aged just 14, was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. Today, he echoes calls for a full national inquiry into Britain's shame. And later in the show, I'll also talk to the peerless campaigner Maggie Oliver for her feedback on what it feels like to be branded far-right by the Prime Minister. And yet, earlier today, when questioned on the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs, Sir Keir Starmer brushed this off as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. Could this lack of empathy turn into a full-blown political crisis for our beleaguered Prime Minister? And Elon Musk has slammed Nigel Farage as not up to the job of being Reform leader after Farage distanced himself from Tommy Robinson. The decision caused a huge backlash and could cost Nigel Farage millions of dollars. But has Nigel Farage done the right thing, or was this an unforced error? And a shocking new analysis of Home Office data shows that foreign criminals are an astonishing 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences than Brits. Albanians, Afghans and Iraqis top the League of Shame. Is it time for mass deportations? Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have your company. The grooming gang scandal, the rape gang scandal is simply blowing all out of control. Today, the Prime Minister, when asked about this by Chris Hope, GBNews political editor, pointing out the fact that there were 50 towns that experienced this, yet only 6 were mentioned in the J reports. The Prime Minister was put under fire. He doubled down, calling this the sentiment of the far right, the bandwagon of the far right. It's an incredible thing to say, echoing what the Prime Minister said after the Southport riots. Is this an error too far for our Prime Minister? An exclusive coming up soon with Marlon, that father who sat down with our peerless national reporter Charlie Peters, and at 5 o'clock I'll be joined by the formidable Maggie Oliver, keeping up pressure on the national scandal that truly is shaming Britain. Get in touch, gbnews.com/your say. But first, here's your headlines, and it's Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you and good afternoon. We start with some breaking news that a 6-month-old baby girl has died after a crash in a multi-storey car park. Sophia Kellerman from Lee in Manchester was injured in a collision in Tenby in Pembrokeshire on Thursday. Police confirmed that Sophia was initially taken to hospital but died of her injuries the following day. The force said the collision happened on the ground floor of the car park and a man has been arrested in connection with that incident. He's due to appear in court on the 7th of February. And in some more breaking news this hour, Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service has declared a major incident as widespread flooding hits Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. The fire brigade has received more than 200 calls since this morning, with crews finding cars stuck in floodwater and evacuating residents from flooded homes. Around 17 people have been rescued so far. Well, weather warnings persisted across the country this morning as many commuters suffered travel disruption from severe weather. Major roads have been closed and railway lines blocked. Manchester Airport's runways were closed early this morning because of heavy snow, but have since reopened. This comes after most of the UK saw heavy snow or icy rainfall over the weekend, and even reaching the coldest night of the winter so far at minus 13.3 degrees. Now to our top story today. The Prime Minister has defended his position as Director of Public Prosecutions, saying child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening, and it was something he had tackled head-on whilst in that role. The Prime Minister has also hit back at Elon Musk over his comments on Twitter that claimed safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is an evil witch and deserved to be in jail. Sir Keir Starmer went on to accuse opposition politicians of amplifying what the far right is saying on child sexual abuse after failing to act for 14 long years. Liberal Democrats leader Sir Ed Davies says the US ambassador should be summoned over Elon Musk's online attacks.
Ambassador should make it clear, both to the current White House and the President-elect, that anyone who is working in a senior level in any American government needs to be very careful about how they comment on UK affairs, whether they're the richest man in the world or anyone else.
Commenting on criticism of Jess Phillips, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has said this: Jess Phillips, Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, has dedicated her career to tackling sexual violence and abuse and to being a voice for victims and survivors of the most terrible crimes, including child sexual abuse. She goes on to say that she has worked with whistleblowers and campaigned tirelessly for justice for those badly let down by endemic institutional failure. Meanwhile, this morning, the Prime Minister pledged to reduce NHS waiting lists, saying we need NHS reform from top to bottom. The Prime Minister has called for more convenience for patients and said that no institution is more important to the security of the country than the NHS. Now, a debate is due to be held this afternoon at around 4:30 in Parliament on the petition calling for a general election. The petition has secured more than 2.5 million signatures after being launched by a West Midlands publican. This is the third most popular e-petition since 2010, after easily surpassing the required 100,000 signatures required for a debate to take place. GB News spoke to the petition's founder, Michael Westwood, about his expectations.
Something I expected us all to be cheerful. I sent it out there in hope that obviously, when you do anything in life, you hope it goes the best you possibly can. And I think this has probably gone as best you possibly can, to be truthful.
In other news, a man has been charged with assisting former soldier Daniel Khalif after he escaped from prison. Khalif was found guilty of spying for Iran after a trial in November last year and admitted to escaping from HMP Wandsworth. Imran Chowdhury, a 25-year-old from North East London, has been charged with one count of assisting an escaped prisoner and will appear at Westminster Magistrates Court tomorrow. And today is Justin Welby's final day as Archbishop of Canterbury as he prepares to step down over failures in handling a Church of England abuse scandal. Almost 2 months after announcing his resignation, he'll officially quit the role at midnight tonight. It follows an independent review which concluded that John Smith, a barrister and Christian camp leader, might have been brought to justice if Archbishop Welby had reported him to the police in 2013. The Archbishop has made few public appearances since mid-November and did not give the traditional Christmas Day sermon from Canterbury Cathedral. And those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Tatiana Sanchez. More from me in half an hour.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now to the story that's shaming Britain, the ongoing scandal into grooming gangs, rape gangs. Sir Keir Starmer brushed off the need for a full public inquiry earlier today into these rape gangs as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. But what do survivors and their families make of this astonishing allegation? We can now speak with our national reporter, Charlie Peters, who's been pushing the envelope on this story all of last week and for 2 years before that. In fact, Charlie Peters, you have an exclusive interview with us. Charlie, an astonishing story, heartbreaking, infuriating, yet one that must be told. Tell us more.
Martin, at this moment there is a significant national conversation going on about this national scandal. As you say, this is a period of our history that shames the United Kingdom. But so much of the focus at the moment is on the politics. It's on the tittle-tattle, on the gossip between Reform, Elon Musk and Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. At GB News, we want to put the survivors and their families at the heart of this national atrocity, of this story and of this campaign that they're fighting to get the recognition for what they endured. And it's in that light and in that approach that this channel has taken that earlier today we spoke with Marlon West, the father of a girl called Scarlett, abused by gangs over several years and has fought for also several years to get some justice. He told me today that he did not have confidence in the Labour government and he called on them to bring in a public national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal.
Marlon, tell us about your experience as a father tackling this kind of abuse.
From the moment that I realised this was happening, so it kind of started when Scarlett was 13, just about to turn 14. And I went to a number of departments in Tameside, obviously social services as well, flagging up my concerns, education. Nobody would listen to me. And very rapidly, that increased. She was going missing all the time, which was definitely one of the red flags for me, which was very much out of character. And the police wouldn't recognise it as grooming. They recognised it as Scarlett being a problematic child, to the point that I had to really, really push social services to put her into care. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I couldn't keep her safe. And even when she went into care, so she went into care for 18 months on a full child protection order, they still wouldn't recognise that she was being groomed. Actually, in one meeting, the social worker told me I was a liar. Now, it was bad before she went into care. Once she became 16, she was out of care and back in the community. Still in child protection, but I was the main carer. Then the grooming was tenfold at 16. And it's not just about grooming. So a lot of people talk about CSE, child sexual exploitation. You always get a criminal element to it because the groomers will use them children as a business. So it's not just about sex, it's about county lines. They all come as one. So one of my arguments is child exploitation, because it's both of them. Yeah. And this is what were happening.
What was happening to Scarlett around this time then when she was 16? What sort of abuse was she enduring?
A lot of the details I found out afterwards, but I kind of knew, because at this point she was going missing for weeks. What I found out afterwards was she was being trafficked. So she was being trafficked to Bury, Rochdale, Bradford. The last place, which is only just 2 years ago, she was trafficked to Rochdale. The groomers were using Airbnbs to move her around. Now, the police did do a sting operation and traced a mobile phone. And they raided this property. But unfortunately, again, not acknowledging the grooming, they actually arrested Scarlett for intent to supply Class A drug, because one of the groomers had a load of heroin and crack in his belongings.
So the horrible situation, you've got your daughter, she's stuck in this abusive cycle, but the police are going for her and not for the abusers.
Yes. So she was bailed for 12 weeks under GMP.
It's Greater Manchester Police.
Greater Manchester Police. Fortunately, at the end of it, they didn't charge her.
Now, have any of her abusers ever been convicted for any of this appalling suffering that she endured?
Not one has been prosecuted. The closest we have got was 3 individuals given a CALM, which is a child abduction warning notice. But then she turned 18, so it wasn't worth the paper it was wrote on.
The grooming gang scandal is back in national attention at the moment. People are talking about calls for a national public inquiry. Do you have faith in the current government's position just to call for some more local reports, like we've seen with Jess Phillips calling for a local review in Oldham?
Absolutely not. The independent inquiries are not worth the paper they're wrote on. I've been campaigning now for nearly 2 years for a national public inquiry. The reason why the independent inquiries are not particularly very helpful is they do the recommendations at the end, and they're not enforceable. So even the ICSA, they've still not put the recommendations in place. And the other thing is, they just skim over it. They don't look, they don't dissect the cases.
The ICSA report covered 6 areas for grooming. Only one of them had previous reports. When you saw that as the father of a victim and a survivor in that appalling abuse, you must have felt that the ICSA report was just a whitewash, a sham.
It's just a whitewash. And the other thing with that is, a lot of it's about institutions. It's not about what we're campaigning about is street grooming, where young girls are being picked up literally off the streets, not by institutions or clubs. Street grooming, which is being ignored.
Do you feel as though the ethnic disparity between the predominantly Pakistani abusers and the predominantly white girl victims has meant that you found it harder to get justice for Scarlett?
Yeah, because everybody's feared of being stereotyped as either being extremely right-winged or racist. But this is factual information. It's not made-up information. But we're feared. I'm feared. You know, I'm a professional. I am very careful what I say.
Do you have confidence in Jess Phillips after she denied the Oldham request by the survivors for an inquiry?
I don't trust any of the Labour ministers now. I am so disappointed because their attitude was different before they came into power, and now I feel like I've had a lot of false promises. So no, I don't. I have no encouragement in any of the MPs.
Today, Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, said that we don't need a national public inquiry. We've had so many reviews already, he said. We won't leave any stone unturned. If there were a public inquiry, how much corruption and cover-up and, frankly, neglect of Britain's children do you think it would uncover?
I predict that there's going to be a lot of cover-ups. I can only talk in my case with Tameside Local Authority. And for them, even now, to deny that there's grooming going on in Tameside is unbelievable. Even with all the evidence, it's overwhelming evidence with Scarlett that she's been groomed. So if this is happening in my town, this is happening all over the country, for whatever reason that is.
If you could deliver a message now to Jess Phillips, Sir Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, all the other Labour ministers about the national grooming gang scandal, what would you say to them?
I've said this previously, I would beg them. I would get on my hands and knees and beg them to reconsider and to support myself and other families and survivors to open up a national public inquiry, because how many independent inquiries are we going to have? They're a waste of taxpayers' money.
Now, Marlon West is one of the bravest men I've ever met, making that bold public demand for a national public inquiry into this appalling grooming gang scandal. GB News can also reveal this afternoon that Marlon West met with the Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips in November, where he introduced to her his demand for a national public inquiry. However, in minutes that were sent to him later after the meeting, all references to a national public inquiry were removed, and instead there was talk of a national strategy. Now, Marlon says he's not opposed to a national strategy, but he's concerned that his demand for an inquiry was removed. You've heard his concerns about the ICSA report, about the so few towns that were looked into that. He now wants an aggressive national review to go into the some 50 different towns and cities that GB News has identified as having these grooming gangs operating in them. And finally, also, he wants justice for his daughter, Scarlett, abused for so many years by these gangs in Greater Manchester, like so many thousands of other girls across Britain.
Charlie Peters, some of the detail of what Scarlett had to endure, it's harrowing and it's heartbreaking in equal measure. She was drugged, she was raped, she was forcibly used, passed around like a piece of meat. She'd go missing. The police were told, the police turned up, they arrested her. At one point, did they not? Because she was passing on drugs. She was being given drugs. She was being drugged. She was being force-fed vodka in hotel rooms. She was picked up in car parks when she was 14 with a car full of grown men. The police did nothing. Here is a father. God knows how he's still alive. God knows how he's still soldiering on. As you said, one of the bravest men you'll ever meet. What does it say when the Prime Minister brushes all this away as being the copybook, the handbook of the far right? And what have other survivors been saying to you today, Charlie Peters? It just seems astonishing that the response from the Prime Minister's office has been so utterly tone deaf.
Well, I was in Tameside earlier this afternoon and this morning when Sir Keir Starmer gave his statements about the grooming gang scandal, when he refers to politicians jumping on the bandwagon sparked, he says, by the far right and their poison. I have to say, well, the messages being sent to me and the phone calls I had with survivors after that speech, I can't repeat them. I just can't. The language was so strong, to be brief, very strong. But some of what I can say is that they were very disgusted by the association of the far right with their cause. They saw it as a grave misstep from the Prime Minister to refer to the far right in this case, because of course, as we know, Martin, across the years, across decades, people feared taking action on this issue precisely because of that fear that they would be labelled extremist, racist, far right, you name it, Islamophobic, the whole works. That was one of the main drivers behind the cover-up culture and the silence and the conspiracy of murmuring that surrounded the grooming gang's atrocity. Now, when you were detailing what had happened to Scarlett there, Martin, I have to say it no longer shocks me, because I've spoken to so many survivors with stories just like Scarlett's. There are so many survivors from towns and cities across this country who've endured similar levels of appalling abuse, unspeakable abuse. Much of it we can't detail on television. It's so horrendous. The only term I can use to summarise it, and we've seen this term used in many court transcripts, is torture. That's what so many of these young girls were put through. But as it stands, there has never been a national inquiry into that torture. There has never been a full aggressive review into all of the towns and cities where there are credible reports of that occurring. That is what political opposition to this Labour government are demanding, and that's what we're hearing, I think, from many survivors across the country today.
John Peter, can I thank you for giving a voice to all these people, to the survivors, and can I thank you for giving a voice to Marlon West, an incredible man. As I said, I don't know if I could still be alive if that happened to my daughter. I honestly don't know what I would do. And I think a great many people watching this programme, probably Charlie Peters, agree. Thank you so much, Charlie. You're doing God's work, as ever. Thank you. Now, a government spokesperson from the Home Office issued the following statement. No child should ever suffer sexual abuse or exploitation, and it is paramount we do more to protect vulnerable children, which is why we are working at pace across government to drive forward real action to implement the recommendations of independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. The government is committed to working closely with survivors and expert groups like ACT on IICSA, and I'll be discussing Sir Keir Starmer brushing off the need for a full public inquiry into grooming gangs next, and in fact we're expecting an emergency statement from Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, around about 5:30. That's coming on the show soon. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Tom Harwood. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Thank you, Britain.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for subscribing.
Thank you for your support.
It's you that make us the People's Channel.
As we reflect on our journey so far, we're filled with immense gratitude.
You mean the world to us.
We couldn't have reached this point without you.
As a very special thank you, we are giving you the chance to win one of 50 GB News thank you boxes. They're worth £50 each.
For full terms and conditions, and to enter, just go to gbnews.com/thank you.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
A Tesco store on a Scottish island has defied locals by ignoring pleas to stay closed on Sundays.
Tesco's has said that no member of staff in Stornoway would be forced to work on a Sunday and that it had received a significant amount of positive reaction to its plans.
Well, let's talk now to the Minister of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, Reverend Kenneth Stewart. Good morning to you, Reverend Stewart. You're trying to keep Sunday special, and if Tesco are going to open up, that means it won't be quite as special for you.
Well, yes, good morning, and thanks for having me on. Yes, Tesco, for some reason, they claim it's not economic advantage, but for some reason they've decided to go against hundreds of years of tradition on this island and the deeply held religious convictions of many, many people, including, of course, their own customers who are really grieved by this decision. We come obviously from the standpoint that a day of rest is effectively mandatory. It's a human right, along with the other 10 commandments which have undergirded our moral and legal fabric in society. It actually enshrines the human right to a day of rest. And of course, in the UK, that's been eroded for many, many years. Incidentally, it's still far more respected on the continent. But for us here, the Sabbath or the day of rest has been very, very important. It's not just what we do, it's who we are. And for some reason, Tesco have decided just to go against that.
And Reverend Stewart, we were actually talking about this earlier, how in European countries, I mean, even in France, which is a secular country, still very few shops will open on a Sunday.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Emily Carver. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Your time is 3:26 with me, Martin Daubney, on GB News. Now, are those calling for an inquiry into grooming gangs jumping on a bandwagon of the far right? Well, that's the astonishing claim made earlier on today by Sir Keir Starmer when he spoke to reporters earlier. And he also appeared to accuse Elon Musk of spreading lies, claiming that many of those calling for an inquiry are not interested in the victims, but only themselves.
It is something about the nature of our politics, because once we lose the anchor that truth matters, in the robust debate we must have, then we're on a very slippery slope. And when politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics, because a robust debate can only be based on the true facts. And that's why this is actually an important point about our politics, not about what anybody may or may not say on Twitter. That actually isn't the main issue. The main issue is, what are politicians here doing to stand up for the things that matter to our democracy and the way that we have robust debate. That's why I want to call this out.
Well, joining me now is GB News' political editor Chris Hope, who was at that press conference. Chris, I watched that press conference earlier on. I was astonished. What I think is just such a tin-eared response. You've got sexual abuse survivors, rape gang survivors who listen to that. And it doesn't matter what Sir Keir Starmer says. It doesn't matter if he thinks that was aimed at Tommy Robinson, at Elon Musk, at whomever. When you say this is the bandwagon of the far right, it smears everybody, and it's gone down very, very badly. You were there. Tell us more.
It did, and it has done with our audience and elsewhere. He did say that child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening. These issues need to be tackled head-on, he said. He did say at DPP he opened the first prosecutions in Rochdale, and he did say that the J recommendations from 2022, Baroness Alexis J, they will be implemented in full, including mandatory reporting. We're going to bring it in. He leapt to the defence of Jess Phillips for saying there'll be no national inquiry to Oldham Council, a line's being crossed. But he just seemed to, I don't know why he was having a go. And I was next question up, so you'll see my question and answer shortly. I was puzzled by the fact he went off saying it's a far-right issue, when really it's not. It's just girls here being harmed, and they want justice. And our point was, and you'll hear in the question, there are only 6 towns mentioned properly in the J report. There are 50 we've identified at GB News. We'll put up a map in a minute, but here's the question we asked the PM.
Critics will say it's not a far-right bandwagon issue, Prime Minister. The ICSA report looked at just 6 towns where grooming gangs were operating. Rochdale got 1 mention in 400 pages. We have found at GB News court reports showing gangs operating in 50 towns across the country. Are you certain, as Prime Minister, it's not going on today? Why don't you order a national public inquiry to join the dots between 50 towns, not 6, barely mentioned in the J report? Are you afraid it might expose failings as your role as a DPP? And that's why Elon Musk says, were you complicit in the rape of Britain? You have not. To go after the far right on this does not go to the heart of the problem.
No. Look, Chris, look, on my record, I think you were actually covering crime when I was DPP. You were quizzing me at the time. I've set out what I did. I actually changed the system because I could see some of the things that were going wrong. I wasn't prepared. Unlike, some Tory politicians, I'm not tweeting about it or talking about it. I got on with changing it. In relation to the serious point you do make, because, this is the victims here suffered terrible abuse, unthinkable, unspeakable, genuinely sickening abuse, and then they weren't listened to. That has to be taken seriously.
So, Sir Keir Starmer talking to me earlier in hospital, Martin. In a later question, he did say he wasn't closing his mind to a full inquiry if others put allegations to us. And I mentioned there are 50 different, from court reports, we've highlighted 50 towns. There's a map, I think, on screen now. It's on GB News' website. The Baroness J report mentions 6 towns. We've got 50 there. And the point to make to the PM is, why not have an inquiry that can join the dots on screen? That's what I think Oldham Council we're looking at. Again, the PM says his mind is not closed to a full investigation.
And that stretches from Yeovil to Glasgow. That is the length and breadth of Britain. And really, to only give a report that gives voice to 6 of those 50 towns isn't good enough. There's been a political reaction to this today. Nigel Farage has said that the inquiries so far are a whitewash, and I believe some Conservatives have lashed out too.
Yeah, Robert Jenrick and, of course, Kevin Baynott were really being criticised in Sir Keir Starmer's language there for getting on this bandwagon, he would say. But Robert Jenrick says in a very long post on Twitter just dropped, he says millions of people in this country just want justice and answers for the thousands of young girls, he says, who are raped and abused in the most evil ways imaginable, and it's all there. And indeed, he says the PM has learned nothing. And I think the frustration for people on this is don't go after it's not a far-right issue to be worried about young girls being attacked in this way. Go after them. He did have a go about Elon Musk, don't forget. Sir Keir Starmer told us earlier that he enjoys the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate, but it's got to be based on truth, not lies, he says, and not on those who are so desperate for attention that they are prepared to debase themselves and their country. That was targeted rightly, or in his world, he would say so, at Elon Musk.
Calling for a national inquiry isn't far right. Calling for a national inquiry seems to be the right thing to do. Certainly, if you speak to the survivors, certainly you speak to the fathers of the abuse, as we have earlier on. This is set to rumble, and I believe Yvette Cooper is set to address the Commons at 5:30 today in response to this.
Well, the Home Office will give a response to in a written statement, or it could be an urgent question. And we're not sure whether it's going to be Yvette Cooper or even could be Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, or a different minister. But we'll be hearing more. It shows how this issue is right back at the top of the agenda in Westminster.
Great stuff, Chris Hope. And we'll be joined by Maggie Oliver at 5 o'clock for her reaction to Keir Starmer's allegation that this is just a far-right bandwagon. Thank you very much. Now, the poll of the day we're asking today, is Elon Musk right to be wading into British politics? And I'll announce the final results at the end of today's show. Now, lots more to come between now and 4 o'clock, including foreigners are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences as British citizens. But first, your latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you. The top stories. The Prime Minister has defended his position as Director of Prosecution, saying child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening, and it was something he had tackled head-on whilst in that role. The Prime Minister has also hit back at Elon Musk over his comments on X that claimed safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is an evil witch and deserved to be in jail. Sir Keir Starmer went on to accuse opposition politicians of amplifying what the far right is saying on child sexual abuse after failing to act for 14 long years. While commenting on the criticism of Jess Phillips, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has said this. She says Jess Phillips, Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, has dedicated her career to tackling sexual violence and abuse and to being a voice for victims and survivors of the most terrible crimes, including child sexual abuse. She has worked with whistleblowers and campaigned tirelessly for justice for those badly let down by endemic institutional failure. Elsewhere, the Prime Minister has pledged to reduce NHS waiting lists, saying we need the NHS to reform from top to bottom. The Prime Minister has called for more convenience for patients and said that no institution is more important to the security of the country than the NHS. In a speech this morning unveiling the government's plans to cut the list of patients waiting more than 18 weeks for NHS treatments in England by nearly 500,000 over the next year. Sir Keir Starmer also said more NHS hubs will be set up in community locations, and there will also be greater use of the private sector to help reduce hospital waiting lists in England. And finally, Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service has declared a major incident as widespread flooding hits Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. The fire brigade has received more than 200 calls since this morning, with crews finding cars stuck in floodwater and evacuating residents from flooded homes. At the moment, around 17 people have been rescued. Weather warnings persisted across the country this morning as many commuters suffered travel disruption from that severe weather. Major roads have been closed and railway lines have been blocked. Manchester Airport's runways were closed early this morning because of heavy snow, but have since reopened. Now, this all comes after most of the UK saw heavy snow or icy rainfall over the weekend, and even reaching the coldest night of the winter so far at minus 13.3 degrees. And those are the latest GB News headlines. For now, more from me in half an hour.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Weather and flood warnings remain in place. The wintry weather will continue for most of this week. Further snow showers in places tonight. If you don't get the snow showers, then it's going to be cold and frosty and potentially icy. The low pressure system that brought all the snow over the weekend is now heading out into the North Sea, taking its wet weather with it. But behind it, the wind's coming down from the north, bringing snow showers across northern Scotland. A mixture of rain, sleet and snow showers for Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest. You could easily get a few more centimetres of snow in places here, but it's going to be quite patchy, certainly close to the coast, mostly rain. But with temperatures tumbling, any showers could lead to things being very icy through the night and first thing on Tuesday morning. So a frosty old start for many central and eastern parts, dry, fine and sunny start, and many places will stay that way through the day. But more snow showers will continue to come in across northern Scotland. Again, perhaps rain close to coast, but inland and certainly over any hills, there'll be more snow building up. Wintry mix across Northern Ireland, sleet, hail, some snow showers here. Same goes for Wales. Again, you could wake up to a covering, a further few centimetres in places. Showers into the southwest, again, potentially making things very slippery on those roads and pavements. During the day, we'll continue to see some showers into the west, some getting into northwest England. Again, chiefly of rain at low levels here, but many eastern and southern parts dry, fine and sunny. Still a cold wind blowing, but not quite as strong, quite as bitter as the winds have been today. But temperatures are still going to struggle below average, even in the sunny spell. 6 or 7 across the south at best. Many places not much above freezing. Another hard frost Tuesday night into Wednesday. And then for Wednesday, we need to keep our eyes on this weather system coming up from the south. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets, but if it hits the colder air, it could bring some significant snow across parts of the south. This is on Wednesday. Stay updated to the forecast.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm Jules Buckley. The M62 westbound, the stretch between Castleford and Rothwell, junction 31 to 30. All the traffic at the moment being held and it's queuing. It's at the scene of a collision. Now, the southbound M61, the exit slip to come off to the A580 closed for emergency repairs. That's at the Swinton interchange, junction 1. Southbound M6 struggling, just one lane open, Knutsford to Middlewich. 19 down to 18, there's a broken down lorry, 3 lanes out in queues. In the M1 roadworks northbound, Rugby up to Catthorpe, 18 up to 19 up to the M6, a lane shut in queues at the scene of a collision there. And the anti-clockwise M25 is still closed, Leatherhead at 9 to Reigate at 8. Long queues to 2 miles before junction 9 anti-clock. It's for emergency barrier and resurfacing repairs.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Welcome back. Your time is 3:39 with me, Martin Daubney, here on GB News. Foreign nationals are more than 3 times as likely to be arrested for sexual offences as British citizens. And the research conducted by the Centre for Migration Control also find that for all crimes, foreign nationals are arrested at twice the rate of native Brits. Well, to discuss this further, let's bring in now the writer and the political commentator, Dr. Mike Jones. Mike, always a pleasure to have your company on the show. An astonishing piece of evidence, data, which I hasten to add was very, very hard to come by. The Centre for Migration Control had to force this out of the Home Office using repeated freedom of information requests. They had to cross-tabulate this data themselves to get a national picture of the kind of data they simply don't want to tell us, and explain to us what you found stood out in this research.
Well, afternoon, Martin. It's very difficult to talk about this, or even to get one's head around it, without feeling pangs of pure anger. And I'm sure you feel exactly the same way. You know, this is a burning injustice and an absolute scandal. It exposes the sheer rot at the heart of our immigration system, which has quite literally ruined people's lives. You know, as you say, foreign nationals are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sexual offences than British nationals, and 2 times more likely to be arrested for crimes per se. And, you know, you've got large cohorts from Albania, Iraq, various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Just look at the numbers, they're mind-boggling. In total, 130,000 foreign nationals were arrested in England and Wales. And these crimes include sexual assaults on children, grooming, human trafficking, and even murder. And these aren't just, you know, statistics in a newspaper or numbers on the computer screen. They're criminal acts that have damaged or ruined people's lives. And if we hadn't have let these people waltz in here, much of that human suffering would have been avoided.
And it's also fair to point out that earlier this year, I got some information out of the Home Office and the ONS. I cross-tabulated on the nationalities most likely to be jailed. And there are lots of familiar names in here: Albania, Afghanistan, Iraq, Algeria, Somalia. They top the leagues of shame across all of the countries where we can get this data. We see very similar patterns in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and yet the Home Office, the British government, will not put this data out willingly. Dr. Mike Jones, is that because they're terrified of when we find out the truth like this, it completely upsets their story about the multicultural dream?
I think they're very worried about it, and it definitely challenges the prevailing narrative, should we say. I mean, back in May of last year, I wrote a paper for Migration Watch. It was called "Is Immigration a Threat to Security?" ? And like you, I struggled to get British data on this. So I had to look overseas, and I looked at sort of comparative research, and I found in Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, certain national groups were disproportionately involved in the most horrific crimes, larceny, sexual offences. And I said in that paper, if we don't get control of our borders, we're going to import these problems here. And, thanks to Rob Bates, we now have the data there. And it's just absolutely horrific.
Yeah, and Rob Bates from the Centre for Migration Control, he will join me tonight on GBN tonight between 7 and 8 p.m. He'll be sat in this studio going through the data and how difficult it was to find it for him. And it's important to point out as well, Mike Jones, that this isn't a case of saying all Albanians are bad people or Afghans are bad people. It's simply a case of saying proportionally, per capita, they have a higher propensity to commit crimes. And surely that means we should be policing them more effectively. We could be targeting communities. Hey, that'd be racist, I hear people cry. But isn't effective targeted policing precisely that? And it also might give us information about who we permit to come into the country in the first place. It might also allow us to say, well, why don't we deport some of these people? Like, we have a returns deal with Albania, but we still have thousands of Albanians languishing in British jails.
Yeah, I agree with you, Martin. It's not about demonisation. It's about pattern recognition. It's about noticing things, and statistics are very powerful tools. The political classes, they love to celebrate diversity, but they don't want to notice it. And when people point out real-world diversity, they're accused of being extremists and so on and so forth. So this is really important, and it has huge implications for asylum and immigration policy, because large-scale immigration is a threat to national security. I'm not just talking about Islamism and jihadism. I'm talking about, day-to-day physical security. And the government really needs to get a grip of this. It needs to look at the legal system, it needs to look at the Human Rights Act, and it needs to speed up deportations.
Dr. Mike Jones, you're absolutely bang on. And remember, facts aren't racist. And the facts tell us 3.5 times more likely for foreign nationals to commit sex offences in Britain. Mike Jones, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Now, in reply, the Home Office told us foreign nationals who commit heinous crimes should be in no doubt that we will do everything to make sure that they are not free on Britain's streets. And this includes removal from the UK. Foreign national offenders can be convicted of several offences. We are transparent with our data and publish data frequently on returns. Now, coming up, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is expected to resign any minute. Is this the death of liberalism? The Prince of Woke is about to bite the bullet. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's News Channel.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Phil Kearsey is bringing a new flavour to the Michelin-starred restaurant Pied à Terre as he becomes its new executive head chef. Customers can expect a menu that showcases modern British cooking, accompanied by classical French roots, which uses hyper-seasonal ingredients. What are hyper-seasonal ingredients? That's an interesting phrase.
It's more about just reacting to the seasonality of everything. We like to change the menu all the time. So basically, I surround myself with the best suppliers, and they tell me what's amazing at the moment, and then we try and celebrate that in the restaurant in many different forms, using taste, texture and technique, and just try and celebrate something as humble as a broccoli stem or a cauliflower, using absolutely everything, and making sure we've got an ever-changing menu, so letting the seasons dictate, so it's never boring and we never get menu fatigue.
OK, your career has taken you around the world a bit.
Yeah.
For example, you were in the United States. What did you learn there?
So, well, every chef I've worked for, it's about to take something from. A lot of chefs will go places and just stay in one establishment and get to the top, and then that's it. I've kind of then went to another chef to learn completely different things. That's the brilliant thing, to be able to surround myself with such amazing chefs throughout my career, because I've learned different things from all of them. And you find out 5 different ways to do something, and you find the way that you like it the best. And it's also about understanding it takes a while to understand how the restaurant is, going through the history of all these amazing chefs that have been before me, the style, because it needs to make sense. You wouldn't have a dish that should be at the Fat Duck and then a dish that should be at the Waterside, you know. You need to make sure that it all makes sense and it goes together with the decor, the service, the wine serving. And so we want to be the restaurant, not that does a little bit of everything, we want to be the best French restaurant in London, you know.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Whether it's breaking royal news,
Will, please bring us up to date.
or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons,
Very, very curious.
we bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Time is 3:48 with me, Martin Daubney, here on GB News. Now let's go live now to Ottawa, where the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is set to announce that he is to step down any minute now. That is a scene from outside of his family residence. Expected to address the nation in a much anticipated press conference, a national address. The pressure has been mounting on Justin Trudeau for many, many months. His poll ratings have absolutely gone through the floor. The economy is on its knees. Inflation is rampant. There's a critical housing shortage. The central cities of Canada have some of the most expensive real estate costs on planet Earth. It's getting up there with places like Hong Kong, and there seems to be no answer in sight. Instead, in return, Prime Minister Trudeau dishes out a regular serving of wokery. This is the high prince of woke. This is somebody who made a national sport of being called Zem, got into his pronouns. We're about now to go to Steve Edgington, GB News' America correspondent. Steve, thanks for joining us. A hugely anticipated national address set to come out. Justin Trudeau, at long last, many might say, set to fall on his sword. Tell us more.
That's right, Martin. Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister of Canada for almost 10 years. He's won 3 national elections, and he was, at one point, a very popular Prime Minister. He was seen as a handsome, charismatic figure, an incredibly progressive politician. However, over the last few years, his poll ratings have absolutely collapsed. It looks as though, and he faces a general election this year, there has to be an election within the next 10 months. And it looks as though his party, the Liberal Party, is set to lose almost all of their seats. They currently have around 150 seats in Parliament, and it looks as though opinion polls suggest he could lose, they could collapse to just 9 seats, and this would be an absolute disaster for his party. So that's probably why he's reading the opinion polls. He is set to resign as the leader of the Liberal Party today, this morning on Canadian time. And he's faced a series of challenges over the last few months within his own party. There have been various caucuses where people in his party have told him to go. There have been resignations in his cabinet. Just a couple of months ago, a very senior minister resigned. And he's been under a lot of pressure from various members of his own party and from the opposition to leave. And it looks as though this morning he is going to resign as the leader of the Liberal Party and welcome a new leader, perhaps even Mark Carney. There's a series of people who could become the Liberal leader. Mark Carney, of course, was the former governor of the Bank of England. So it's a very interesting time in Canada, a very very chaotic period for Canadian politics and for the Conservatives. And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada, this is a very exciting opportunity.
And Steve Edgerton, the tide really began to turn, did it not, during COVID lockdowns? For a so-called progressive liberal, Mr. Trudeau became very illiberal, freezing the bank accounts of truckers who dared to protest against him over his vaccine mandates, which basically ended their right to be able to work, to be able to cross borders. Compulsory vaccine mandates, compulsory passports, the freezing of bank accounts, an obsession with wokery, with pronouns, with net zero, and ever since then the writing has been on the wall and the economy is simply tanking.
That's right. So the Canadian trucker protests, as you say, these were protests against vaccine mandates. That was the point really at which his opinion poll ratings began to collapse. That was the low point really of his premiership and perhaps the nail in his coffin as Prime Minister and as leader of the Liberal Party. Ever since then, his opinion polls have been negative, they have been declining. And as you say, there's a series of issues facing Canadians. The economy is a huge problem. The cost of living in Canada has skyrocketed under Justin Trudeau. There's been huge levels of inflation, particularly in the housing market. You know, if you think house prices are bad in Britain, just look at Canada. It's just as bad, if not worse. He's undertaken, or he's overseen, mass immigration to Canada. Again, similar levels to what we've seen in Britain, and Canada's a smaller nation than Britain. I think there's about 34 million people living in Canada, and he's presided over huge levels of mass migration from all around the world, particularly from India. This has caused a huge squeeze on house prices, and ordinary Canadians are suffering, definitely from an economic perspective. This is one of the issues that Pierre Poilievre have been talking about.
OK, Steve Edgerton, we have to leave it there. And we'll, of course, continue to bring you updates from Canada as we get them. Thank you, Steve Edgerton, there from Washington, D.C. Now, still to come, a dad from Rochdale speaks exclusive to GB News after his daughter was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. That's next with me, Martin Daubney. But now, it's time for your weather.
Despite the morning rain, it'll be a nice, warm, cosy day ahead. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Weather and flood warnings remain in place. The wintry weather will continue for most of this week. Further snow showers in places tonight. If you don't get the snow showers, then it's going to be cold and frosty and potentially icy. The low pressure system that brought all the snow over the weekend is now heading out into the North Sea, taking its wet weather with it. But behind it, the wind's coming down from the north, bringing snow showers across northern Scotland. A mixture of rain, sleet and snow showers for Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest. You could easily get a few more centimetres of snow in places here, but it's going to be quite patchy, certainly close to the coast, mostly rain. But with temperatures tumbling, any showers could lead to things being very icy through the night and first thing on Tuesday morning. So a frosty old start for many central and eastern parts, dry, fine and sunny start, and many places will stay that way through the day. But more snow showers will continue to come in across northern Scotland. Again, perhaps rain close to coast, but inland and certainly over any hills, there'll be more snow building up. Wintry mix across Northern Ireland, sleet, hail, some snow showers here. Same goes for Wales. Again, you could wake up to a covering, a further few centimetres in places. Showers into the southwest, again, potentially making things very slippery on those roads and pavements. During the day, we'll continue to see some showers into the west, some getting into northwest England. Again, chiefly of rain at low levels here, but many eastern and southern parts dry, fine and sunny. Still a cold wind blowing, but not quite as strong. quite as bitter as the winds have been today, but temperatures are still going to struggle below average, even in the sunny spell. 6 or 7 across the south at best. Many places not much above freezing. Another hard frost Tuesday night into Wednesday, and then for Wednesday we need to keep our eyes on this weather system coming up from the south. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets, but if it hits the colder air, it could bring some significant snow across parts of the south. This is on Wednesday. Stay updated to the forecast.
There will be a light breeze in the morning, leading to a warm front. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm Jules Buckley. Problems continue in West Yorkshire for the westbound M62. Now, 2 lanes are out, 31 to 30, Castleford to Rothwell. The entry slip road at junction 31 is also part blocked. That ongoing collision still causing queues. Long delays, southbound M6 towards and past Knutsford at 19. There was a breakdown. All lanes are back open now, but it's still quite slow going. It is improving though. Also on the M6 southbound, Stafford North to Stafford South, junction 14 to 13. There's a breakdown blocking lane 104, still causing 1 or 2 delays, and the anti-clockwise M25. Now that's still closed. Leatherhead to Reigate, junction 9 to 8. Keys to 2 miles before junction 9 for emergency repairs. That also means clockwise down to 2 lanes at junction 8, and that's queuing too. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
£50,000 in tax-free cash is like having over £4,000 each month to play with for a whole year. And it could be yours in the biggest Great British giveaway so far. That could be a holiday each month, your mortgage covered, or just the ability to send some of those day-to-day financial stresses packing. For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. You can call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB10 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 31st of January. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
This is Britain's Newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK.
We're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
A very good afternoon to you. It's 4 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News. We're broadcasting for you live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK. On today's show, GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters interviews Marlon, a dad from Rochdale, for 2 years. His daughter, Scarlett, then aged just 13, was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. Today, he echoes calls for a full national inquiry into Britain's shame. Later in the show, I'll also talk to the peerless campaigner Maggie Oliver to find out her reaction to what Sir Keir Starmer said earlier on, because earlier today, when questioned on the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs, Sir Keir Starmer brushed this off as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. Could this lack of empathy turn into a full-blown political crisis for our beleaguered Prime Minister? And Elon Musk has slammed Nigel Farage as not up to the job of being Reform leader after Farage distanced himself from Tommy Robinson. The decision caused a backlash and could cost Farage millions of dollars. But has Farage done the right thing, or is this a political own goal? And a shocking new analysis of Home Office data shows that foreign criminals are an astonishing 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex crimes than Brits. Albanians, Afghans and Iraqis top the League of Shame. Is it time for mass deportations? Welcome to the show. Always a pleasure to have your company. Would you like a full, transparent, apolitical, national and ruthless investigation, inquiry into the shame of Britain's rape gangs? I would, and I think millions of others would too. And yet today, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, appeared to say this was the rhetoric, the bandwagon of the far right. Why is it far right to want the right thing? Why is it far right to put the needs of thousands of white working class girls' lives who were abused and perhaps ruined forever? Why is it far right to put them at the top? Get in touch, gbnews.com/your say. But first, time for your headlines, and here's Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you very much. Let's take you straight to Ottawa now and the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
C'est ce qui me motive à chaque jour où j'ai le privilège de servir dans ce poste. C'est pourquoi, depuis 2015, je me suis battu pour ce pays, pour vous, pour renforcer la classe moyenne. Pourquoi nous nous sommes...
Well, we'll of course bring you more on that story as we get it. And we have been hearing all day so far that the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is announcing that he's standing down. So as soon as we get that, we will bring it live to you. He's, of course, been in that role for 9 years. Justin Trudeau, speaking in Ottawa at the moment. We'll bring you more on that story as we get it. Elsewhere, the Prime Minister has defended his position as Director of Public Prosecutions, saying child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening, and it was something that he had tackled head-on when he was in that role. Well, the Prime Minister has also hit back at Elon Musk over his comments on X that claimed Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is an evil witch. Well, let's take you back to Ottawa and Justin Trudeau.
Motivated by what is in the best interest of Canadians. And the fact is, despite best efforts to work through it, Parliament has been paralysed for months after what has been the longest session of a minority parliament in Canadian history. That's why this morning I advised the Governor-General that we need a new session of Parliament. She has granted this request, and the House will now be prorogued until March 24th. Over the holidays, I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process. Last night, I asked the President of the Liberal Party to begin that process. This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election. Mes chers amis, comme vous savez, je suis un fighter. Dans mon fort intérieur, je me suis toujours battu parce que je me soucie profondément des Canadiens. Et je serai toujours motivé par ce qui est dans le meilleur intérêt des Canadiens. Et le fait est que malgré tous les efforts déployés pour passer à travers, le Parlement est paralysé depuis des mois, après ce qui a été la plus longue session d'un Parlement minoritaire dans l'histoire de notre pays. C'est pourquoi ce matin, j'ai rencontré la gouverneure générale pour lui faire savoir que nous avions besoin d'une nouvelle session du Parlement. Elle a accédé à ma demande et la Chambre sera donc prorogée jusqu'au 24.
Well, as you've just heard that breaking news there, that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just announced that he is to resign. He's been facing growing pressure from inside his governing Liberal Party after a surge in support for opposition Conservatives in the polls, and the 53-year-old has just announced that he is going to step down. More on that as we get it. Now it's back to Martin.
Thank you, Tatiana. And as expected, that was the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, resigning to the nation. Let's cross now back to GB News' North American correspondent Steve Edginson for some reaction. So, Steve, we expected him to fall on his sword, and he did. Came across first in French and then in English. Pompous till the very end. Tell us more.
He talked about his legacy as Prime Minister. He talked about funding the war in Ukraine. He talked about trying to expand the middle class. He's obviously very proud of his legacy. I think many Canadians would probably disagree with that. And he's now said that he is resigning as the leader of the Liberal Party to allow his party to select a new leader and then a new Prime Minister. He also prorogued Parliament. So I think Justin Trudeau could see the writing on the wall. Anyone can read these opinion polls. They had absolutely collapsed for his party, the Liberal Party. It looks like they're heading to total destruction in the next Canadian election. And I think people were expecting him to resign. This was a significant moment in Canadian politics. This will represent a new change, a transformation in Canadian politics, perhaps away from Justin Trudeau's ultra-liberal, ultra-progressive perspective on politics and towards a more conservative perspective with perhaps the new Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, a conservative who seems more hardline on issues like immigration, transgenderism, freedom of speech, the economy, than Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, and as you say, perhaps not only in Canada, but further beyond. Is this now another nation where liberalism is dying out? Justin Trudeau's politics being rejected. We saw over the American border, Joe Biden's politics similarly rejected, and across the European continent, liberalism seems to be withering away. Justin Trudeau dramatically resigning as Canadian Prime Minister. Thanks for that full update. Steve Edginson, of course, will come back to you later in the show for a further reflection. Thank you. Now moving on to the story that's shaming Britain, and it's the ongoing scandal into grooming gangs. Keir Starmer brushed off the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs earlier on today by saying it's jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. But what do survivors and their family make of this? Well, let's cross now to our national reporter, Charlie Peters, who has an exclusive interview for us. Charlie Peters, tell us more. I know you sat down with an incredibly brave father, Marlon West, whose daughter Scarlett was trafficked and abused for years by a Pakistani rape gang. It's an astonishing interview. Tell us more.
Good afternoon, Martin. Yes, well, Marlon West, the father of Scarlett, who survived and continues to persevere against that horrendous ordeal that she continues to endure, are just a couple of the voices I've heard from today in reaction to this quite astonishing development in the national grooming gang scandal story, which is Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, answering questions on his record on the issue this morning, in which he said that there was a problem with politicians jumping on the bandwagon on this issue as caused by poison from the far right. I have to say I've heard some extremely severe responses from survivors across the country in reaction to that. One victim from Rotherham said that it was offensive to lump their experiences and their campaigning in with far-right activism, whatever that means. But at the same time, there's also been a desire to bring this discussion back to the survivors, back to their issue, back to their demand for a national public inquiry, which we've heard from so many over the last week since we broke the news last Wednesday that Jess Phillips, the Safeguarding Minister, had denied a government-led inquiry into Oldham. Now, one group of people I spoke to today includes Marlon West, that father, Martin, an extremely brave man, who told me not only about his ongoing troubles to deal with this crisis, but also about his experience of battling with Labour to ensure his voice and his demand for an inquiry is heard.
Marlon, tell us about your experience as a father tackling this kind of abuse.
From the moment that I realised this was happening, so it kind of started when Scarlett was 13, just about to turn 14. And I went to a number of departments in Tameside, obviously social services as well, flagging up my concerns, education. Nobody had listened to me. And very rapidly, that increased. She was going missing all the time, which was definitely one of the red flags for me, which was very much out of character. And the police wouldn't recognise it as grooming. They recognised it as Scarlett being a problematic child, to the point that I had to really, really push social services to put her into care. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I couldn't keep her safe. And even when she went into care, so she went into care for 18 months on a full child protection order, they still wouldn't recognise that she was being groomed. Actually, in one meeting, the social worker told me I was a liar. Now, it was bad before she went into care. Once she became 16, she was out of care and back in the community. Still in the child protection, but I was the main carer. Then the grooming was tenfold at 16. And it's not just about grooming. So a lot of people talk about CSE, child sexual exploitation. You always get a criminal element to it because the groomers will use them children as a business. So it's not just about sex, it's about county lines. They all come as one. So one of my arguments is child exploitation, because it's both of them. And this is what was happening.
What was happening to Scarlett around this time then when she was 16? What sort of abuse was she enduring?
A lot of the details I found out afterwards, but I kind of knew, because at this point she was going missing for weeks. What I found out afterwards was she was being trafficked. So she was being trafficked to Bury, Rochdale, Bradford. The last place, which is only just 2 years ago, she was trafficked to Rochdale. The groomers were using Airbnbs to move her around. Now, the police did do a sting operation and traced a mobile phone. And they raided this property. But unfortunately, again, not acknowledging the grooming, they actually arrested Scarlett for intent to supply Class A drug, because one of the groomers had a load of heroin and crack in his belongings.
So the horrible situation, you've got your daughter, she's stuck in this abusive cycle, but the police are going for her and not for the abusers.
Yes. So she was bailed for 12 weeks under GMP.
It's Greater Manchester Police.
Greater Manchester Police. Fortunately, at the end of it, they didn't charge her.
Now, have any of her abusers ever been convicted for any of this appalling suffering that she endured?
Not one has been prosecuted. The closest we have got was 3 individuals given a CALM, which is a child abduction warning notice. But then she turned 18, so it wasn't worth the paper it was wrote on.
The grooming gang scandal is back in national attention at the moment. People are talking about calls for a national public inquiry. Do you have faith in the current government's position just to call for some more local reports, like we've seen with Jess Phillips calling for a local review in Oldham?
Absolutely not. The independent inquiries are not worth the paper they wrote on. I've been campaigning now for nearly 2 years for a national public inquiry. The reason why the independent inquiries are not particularly very helpful is they do the recommendations at the end and they're not enforceable. So even the ICSA they've still not put the recommendations in place. And the other thing is, they just skim over it. They don't dissect the cases.
The ICSA report covered 6 areas for grooming. Only one of them had previous reports. When you saw that as the father of a victim and a survivor in that appalling abuse, you must have felt that the ICSA report was just a whitewash, a sham.
It's just a whitewash. And the other thing with that is, a lot of it's about institutions. It's not about what we're campaigning about is street grooming, where young girls are being picked up literally off the streets, not by institutions or clubs. Street grooming, which is being ignored.
Do you feel as though the ethnic disparity between the predominantly Pakistani abusers and the predominantly white girl victims has meant that you found it harder to get justice for Scarlett?
Yeah, because everybody's feared of being stereotyped as either being extremely right-winged or racist. But this is factual information. It's not made-up information. But we're feared. I'm feared. You know, I'm a professional. I am very careful what I say.
Do you have confidence in Jess Phillips after she denied the Oldham request by the survivors for an inquiry?
I don't trust any of the Labour ministers now. I am so disappointed because their attitude was different before they came into power, and now I feel like I've had a lot of false promises. So no, I don't. I have no encouragement in any of the MPs.
Today, Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, said that we don't need a national public inquiry. We've had so many reviews already, he said. We won't leave any stone unturned. If there were a public inquiry, how much corruption and cover-up and, frankly, neglect of Britain's children do you think it would uncover?
I predict that there's going to be a lot of cover-ups. I can only talk in my case with Tameside Local Authority, and for them even now to deny that there's grooming going on in Tameside is unbelievable. Even with all the evidence, it's overwhelming evidence with Scarlett that she's been groomed. So if this is happening in my town, this is happening all over the country, for whatever reason that is.
If you could deliver a message now to Jess Phillips, Sir Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, all the other Labour ministers about the national grooming gang scandal, what would you say to them?
I've said this previously. I would beg them. I would get on my hands and knees and beg them to reconsider and to support myself and other families and survivors to open up a national public inquiry, because how many independent inquiries are we going to have? They're a waste of taxpayers' money.
Martin, that was the face and the voice of pure bravery. Marlon West, one of the only public family members of a survivor who talks about this so openly, about what he's enduring, about what the state is failing to do for him. The other father I've spoken to recently for GB News, he's known as Jack. He's not as public with his coverage, but he has shown in his experiences speaking to GB News that there are several instances where he was threatened with arrest by South Yorkshire police when he was conducting his own attempts to save his daughter. Now, Marlon West also told GB News earlier today that he had a meeting with Jess Phillips in November where he referred to his desire for a national public inquiry, but unfortunately, he said, references to that were removed from the minutes from the meeting. He said that instead, the minutes that have been seen exclusively by GB News focus entirely on a national strategy. Now, he's been very clear, as have so many survivors today, they want that ruthless, as you said, Martin, aggressive public inquiry to go to the 50 different towns and cities that GB News has identified as being part of this crisis. And just think about what we heard about Scarlett there, being trafficked to different towns. Many of the towns that Scarlett was trafficked to have not had a single review into that abuse. That's what Marlon, Scarlett and so many other survivors want.
And Charlie Peter, what's astonishing about this story, when you look at the detail, it's simply horrific. 13-year-old daughter kidnapped, drugged, given cocaine, vodka, beaten, raped in hotel rooms, waking up often with no recollection of what had happened to her. And just to repeat that one line that Marlon West said there, not one single person has ever been prosecuted for anything that happened to his beautiful, beautiful daughter. There's no wonder, Charlie Peters, that fathers like Marlon West have no faith in the system, they have no faith in the police, they have no faith in the inquiries thus far, they've got no faith in our politicians, and that is why they want a full, independent national inquiry, and I think it's absolutely repellent that even be considered to call them far-right. I really, really do. Charlie Peters, thank you very, very much there. I see you struggling with your lighting, but thank you very, very much for joining us for another amazing, painful, but so necessary exclusive for us on GBNews. And thank you to Marlon West. You truly, truly are a real, genuine man to speak out like that in defence of your daughter. Thank you so much for talking to us at GBNews. And all God bless your wonderful daughter, Scarlett. Thank you. Now, a government spokesperson from the Home Office issued the following statement. No child should ever suffer sexual abuse or exploitation, and it is paramount we do more to protect vulnerable children, which is why we are working at pace across government to drive forward real action to implement the recommendations of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. The government is committed to working closely with survivors and expert groups like ACT on the IICSA. Let's stay tuned as I will discuss Sir Keir Starmer's brushing off the need for that full public inquiry into grooming gangs, calling it the rhetoric of the far right. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Ellie Costello, and thank you so much for joining us here on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
The BBC has been branded jaw-achingly stupid, not by me, by the way, over its decision to cast black and ethnic minority actors in the historical drama of Wolf Hall. Now, is this a forward-thinking idea or nonsense? Are we rewriting history? Henry, I mean, the Tudors were real-life people. They were pretty much white.
Well, some of these shows depart so much from historical context anyway that maybe it doesn't make any difference. But I think just generally we've got a problem in this country with portraying history in its correct sense. You can't change history. And I think it's about the motivation. If the motivation is to sort of to some sort of, you know, to make a political point, then I think it's wrong.
What I find kind of tedious about people finding this instant jaw-droppingly stupid, Jesus was portrayed by somebody who's half Slovak and half Irish. Moses was portrayed in the Exodus by an Englishman. So, you know, same with Anne Boleyn, you know, was portrayed by Natalie Portman, who is Jewish. So if this is the one thing that's getting people angry, then there's something deeper within that rage, because I think Hollywood's been doing that, where people...
When you say something deeper, do you think there is a hidden racism and people are complaining about this?
Well, I think for some, maybe, yes. I can't speak for everybody because this news dropped today. I don't know why they are thinking that it's egregious. But there absolutely must be some underlying racism if this is the only one that you're upset about.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Thank you, Britain.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for subscribing.
Thank you for your support.
It's you that make us the People's Channel.
As we reflect on our journey so far, we're filled with immense gratitude.
You mean the world to us. We couldn't have reached this point without you.
As a very special thank you, we are giving you the chance to win one of 50 GB News thank you boxes. They're worth £50 each.
For full terms and conditions, and to enter, just go to gbnews.com/thank you.
I'm Andrew Pearce. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 4:25 with me, Martin Daubney, here on GB News. Now, brace yourselves, get out the Kleenex, because the king of woke, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, has just announced he is standing down after 9 years in office. Trudeau has faced growing pressure from inside his government, his governing Liberal Party, after a surge in support for the opposition Conservatives in the polls. And around about 20 minutes ago, Trudeau finally fell on his sword. We can now speak with the North American political commentator Lee Cohen. Lee, welcome to the show. So the writing was on the wall. Justin Trudeau was a marked man. The economy is tanking. The polls are sinking like a lead balloon. And today he finally did the honourable thing and he resigned. Tell us, will he be missed? What will his legacy be?
Well, good afternoon, Martin. Thanks so much for having me. One thing is clear, Trump's not even in the Oval Office, and already his ideological opponents are falling like dominoes. Clearly, Trump's opinions and his rhetoric weighed heavily on Trudeau. His critiques of Trudeau's handling of the economy, trade imbalances, and leadership have clearly struck a nerve and, made his continued service very tenuous and indeed impossible if this action speaks to that. Clearly, Trump's America First, Country First approach, which contrasts with Trudeau's globalist policies, it's clear that economic nationalism is resonating more with Canadians right now than Trudeau's approach.
And Lee Cohen, for a Liberal, it's fair to say, particularly during COVID lockdowns, Prime Minister Trudeau had some very illiberal policies. For example, when he brought in his compulsory vaccine mandates, we saw hundreds and hundreds of truckers take to the roads, forming blockades in the capital. For their penalty, they had their bank accounts blocked by Justin Trudeau, who's literally starving truckers off of those picket lines, which doesn't sound very liberal, forcing them to have vaccine mandates, forcing them to have passports, some joking at the time that he'd tested positive for fascism. So for a Liberal, he became very, very illiberal, and that, in many ways, marked the beginning of his downfall. Did he just... Yeah. I think he's completely frozen there. Lee Cohen simply froze. I'm afraid we lost him for now. Perhaps I'd come back to the studio and talk to Catherine Forster, our political correspondent, who's joined us. A quick word there on Justin Trudeau. You and I having a quick natter before we got to Lee Cohen there. But is this a political direction of travel? Is this, one by one, the woke dominoes falling?
Well, he is the last major Western leader still standing from the sort of pre-Trump era, that one after another they have gone. Angela Merkel, Macron is in difficulties, Scholz's government has collapsed, and so on and so forth. And just talking about Canada and lockdowns, just remind me, I was in Canada 2022, and they were doing random testing off the plane for COVID. I had to go to this huge warehouse where everyone was in like full body suits. It was astonishing. I couldn't believe it. And I took a picture, and as I left, I had to delete it, and I just couldn't believe how they were on it at a time where we were becoming much more relaxed. And I did think then, my goodness, Canadians, how do they feel about this? And it turns out that, OK, he's been PM for nearly 10 years, but clearly Canada has had enough of Justin Trudeau. And I know you did a fascinating report over there about a sister dying. And a lot of people were saying this was an example of how liberal Canada was becoming. I know your report, which is excellent, you said there are very big reservations, great fears about the country becoming so liberal. Perhaps that was being abused. Yeah, it was one of the most shocking interviews I've ever done, because, of course, the assisted dying bill is now going through Parliament. But what's happened there is it started quite narrow for those with terminal illness. Yeah. As we are told, this one in Britain will do, but then it is challenged by the courts, it gets broadened, and there were cases of military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder who were going for help and assistance, or disabled people going for modifications with their homes that were pointed towards assisted dying, and it's potentially going to be legalised for people with mental health conditions from 2027. It was going to have already happened, but there's been resistance. Very, very shocking indeed. And I think Donald Trump, OK, he's not in office yet. He comes in on January the 20th, but already he's having an influence because there's been disagreements within Canada about how they might deal with the tariffs that Trump keeps talking about. So Donald Trump is having a huge influence, even though he's not even in office quite yet.
2 weeks today. 2 weeks today, Donald Trump will be sworn in. That's something to look forward to, perhaps for some. And novellist Catherine Forster, excellent as ever. Thank you. There's lots more still to come between now and 5 o'clock, including we'll be discussing Keir Starmer brushing off the need for a full public inquiry into grooming gangs as jumping on the far-right bandwagon. But first, here's your headlines, and it's Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you. First to that breaking news that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced his resignation. Trudeau has faced growing pressure from inside his governing Liberal Party after a surge in support for the opposition Conservatives in the polls. The 53-year-old steps down after 9 years in office, and he says he'll step down as soon as his party choose a replacement for him. Trudeau says that although he's a fighter, the Parliament he's serving is paralysed under his leadership.
The Liberal Party of Canada is an important institution in the history of our great country and democracy. A new Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party will carry its values and ideals into that next election. I'm excited to see the process unfold in the months ahead. We were elected for the third time in 2021 to strengthen the economy post-pandemic and advance Canada's interests in a complicated world. And that is exactly the job that I and we will continue to do for Canadians.
And some more breaking news this hour that a 39-year-old man has been jailed over involvement in the Southport attacks last summer. Andrew McIntyre has been jailed for 7.5 years at Liverpool Crown Court today for encouraging violent disorder and criminal damage following the knife attack at a dance class in Southport. Sentencing McIntyre, Judge Neil Flewitt Casey said the defendant was prominent among people responsible for spreading misinformation following the attack. And the Prime Minister has defended his position as Director of Public Prosecutions, saying child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening, and it was something he had tackled head-on whilst in that role. The Prime Minister has also hit back at Elon Musk over his comments on X that claimed Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is an evil witch and deserves to be in jail. Sir Keir Starmer went on to accuse opposition politicians of amplifying what the far right is saying on child sexual abuse after failing to act for 14 long years. Liberal Democrats leader Sir Ed Davey says the US ambassador should be summoned over Elon Musk's online attacks. And those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Tatiana Sanchez. More news from me in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Weather and flood warnings remain in place. The wintry weather will continue for most of this week. Further snow showers in places tonight. If you don't get the snow showers, then it's going to be cold and frosty and potentially icy. The low pressure system that brought all the snow over the weekend is now heading out into the North Sea, taking its wet weather with it. But behind it, the wind's coming down from the north, bringing snow showers across northern Scotland. A mixture of rain, sleet and snow showers for Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest. You could easily get a few more centimetres of snow in places here, but it's going to be quite patchy. Certainly close to the coast, mostly rain, but with temperatures tumbling Any showers could lead to things being very icy through the night and first thing on Tuesday morning. So a frosty old start for many central and eastern parts. Dry, fine and sunny start, and many places will stay that way through the day. But more snow showers will continue to come in across northern Scotland. Again, perhaps rain close to coast, but inland and certainly over any hills, there'll be more snow building up. Wintry mix across Northern Ireland, sleet, hail, some snow showers here. Same goes for Wales. Again, you could wake up to a covering, a further few centimetres in places. Showers into the southwest, again, potentially making things very slippery on those roads and pavements. During the day, we'll continue to see some showers into the west, some getting into northwest England. Again, chiefly of rain at low levels here, but many eastern and southern parts dry, fine and sunny. Still a cold wind blowing, but not quite as strong, quite as bitter as the winds have been today. But temperatures are still going to struggle below average, even in the sunny spell. 6 or 7 across the south at best. Many places not much above freezing. Another hard frost Tuesday night into Wednesday. And then for Wednesday, we need to keep our eyes on this weather system coming up from the south. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets, but if it hits the colder air, it could bring some significant snow across parts of the south. This is on Wednesday. Stay updated to the forecast.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm Jules Buckley. Still 2 lanes out on the westbound M62, Castleford to Rothwell, junction 31 to 30. The entry slip at junction 31, also part block. This queuing is all at the scene of an accident there. Now a spillage on the southbound M6 means 2 lanes out of 3 out and very slow going. Just away from the Kiel services down to Stoke at junction 15. Cambridgeshire, the southbound M11. Now the exit slip coming off at Cambridge South and Harston, junction 11's part blocked. There's a vehicle fire there still causing queues, and big delay still for the M25. Now anti-clockwise still closed Leatherhead to Reigate junction 9 to 8, queuing for 2 miles before junction 9. Clockwise also down to 2 lanes at junction 8. It's all for barrier repairs. That clockwise queue back towards junction 7 for the M23.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Welcome back. Your time is 4:37 with me, Martin Daubney, on GB News. Now, earlier today, when questioned on the need for a full public inquiry into the rape gangs, Keir Starmer brushed this off seemingly as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. Now, could this lack of empathy turn into a full-blown political crisis for the Prime Minister? Now, as we speak, MPs are debating a petition, as you can see on your screen there, calling for a fresh general election, which has so far garnered over 3 million signatures. But let's get back now to that comment earlier on by the Prime Minister, and I'm joined in the studio by GB News' political correspondent Catherine Forster. Catherine, I watched that press conference earlier on, and when Keir Starmer said that this was jumping on the bandwagon of the far right, my jaw fell open. Tell us more.
Yes, of course, Sir Keir Starmer at a hospital wanting to talk about NHS reform, wanting to get on the front foot, wanting to get some good headlines, but everything is being taken over by Elon Musk and the grooming gangs scandal. So he, in fairness to Starmer, what he said was he said that politicians calling for a statutory inquiry were, quote, jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. But I don't think most people are going to hear that. I think, frankly, that's going to get lost, and they will hear far right being equated with wanting an inquiry. Now, he said we've had lots of inquiries. The time is time basically just for action. But our political editor, Chris Hope, had a question. Let's see what he had to say.
Critics will say it's not a far-right bandwagon issue, Prime Minister. The ICSA report looked at just 6 towns where grooming gangs were operating. Rochdale got 1 mention in 400 pages. We have found that GB News court report showing gangs operating in 50 towns across the country. Are you certain, as Prime Minister, it's not going on today? Why don't you order a national public inquiry to join the dots between 50 towns, not 6, barely mentioned in the J report? Are you afraid it might expose failings as your role as a DPP? And that's why Elon Musk says, were you complicit in the rape of Britain? You have not. To go after the far right on this does not go to the heart of the problem.
No. Well, Chris, look, on my record,
I think you were actually covering crime when I was DPP. You were quizzing me at the time. I've set out what I did. I actually changed the system because I could see some of the things that were going wrong. I wasn't prepared. Unlike, some Tory politicians, I'm not tweeting about it or talking about it. I got on with changing it. In relation to the serious point you do make, because, this is the victims here suffered terrible abuse, unthinkable, unspeakable, genuinely sickening abuse, and then they weren't listened to. That has to be taken seriously.
Catherine, I mean, I just found that astonishing. And the fact of the matter is, you're exactly right. Now, Sir Keir Starmer can say, no, that comment was aimed at politicians. It was aimed at people like Tommy Robinson. But Charlie Peters has been with survivors today. He's been with the father of a victim who's all feel that this is being aimed at them, that anybody decent who believes in child protection is belonging to the far right. It's backfired spectacularly.
Yes, an incredible interview from Charlie Peters with that father, wasn't it? And of course, Charlie Peters is the reason that all this has ignited, really, in that he had that amazing scoop last week where Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, said no to a national inquiry. Now, the government, their line is there's been lots of inquiries, but as we have discovered, yes, there was a broad general inquiry, but it didn't focus on the grooming gangs, and there's been a couple of local inquiries. But the J report, the national report, only looked at 6 areas in terms of grooming that were not, Telford or Rotherham were barely in there. Now, GB News has identified, and I think we've got a map, I think 50 towns across the country, from Glasgow in Scotland right down to Yeovil, where this pattern has been identified. So victims, many that Charlie Peters has been talking to, absolutely furious by the Prime Minister's words and reactions. They feel that they simply have never had the necessary investigation, let alone the justice, because bear in mind, some of these people are still, haven't been charged, hadn't been convicted, and for all the huge amounts of criticism of Elon Musk, and certainly he's said some incredibly inflammatory things, and the Prime Minister very, very angry, saying lies and disinformation.
But we're talking about it.
What he has done is we're talking about it. There's something that I can't repeat on air because it is so horrific, but it was basically a paragraph from a court transcript describing in graphic detail what had happened to one girl. It is unimaginable what these young, often working class, disadvantaged white girls suffered. And the authorities, all too often, whether it was social services, whether it was the police, whether it was local councillors, simply did not do their job, which is to keep its citizens safe.
And there's been some political reaction to this. So Nigel Farage said earlier on that the inquiries so far have been a whitewash, echoing what Charlie Peters said, and the point you made there about only 6 out of those 50 towns have been mentioned. And in the last 25 minutes to half an hour, Kemi Badenoch has made comment. What she said?
Yes, this is interesting. So Tory leader Kemi Badenoch has said that they are going to try to force a vote. Now, there's a bill coming to Parliament, here it is, on Wednesday. And she said, I was serious when I said it's time to get justice for victims. So on Wednesday, Conservatives will put forward an amendment to the Children's Wellbeing Bill to require a full national inquiry into the rape gangs grooming scandal. If the amendment is selected, I hope MPs from all parties will vote to support the inquiry so that we can do the right thing by the victims and end the culture of cover-ups. Now, of course, we don't know whether it will be selected. And, of course, the Conservatives, sure, they had 14 years that they could have done this, and they didn't. Sure, the recommendations of the J report have not been implemented. But I think it will be very interesting to see what happens on Wednesday.
And no doubt the Conservatives is trying to force the Labour Party into voting against this, and then all hell will break loose. Catherine Forster, excellent as ever. Thank you very much. Now, coming next, foreigners are astonishing 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex offences as British citizens. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
But it turns out there's a growing number of grandparents who are now taking up the hobby.
And not all of them are male. 7 million gamers are aged over 50, 7 million of them. And we're going to introduce you to one this morning. Her name's Kath Bowie. She's 76 years of age, and Kath has become a worldwide star of the game Fortnite. Good to see you, Kath.
Hello, good morning to both of you.
And tell me this, Kath, is Bowie your real name?
Bowie. Yeah.
Bowie.
Yeah, it is my real name, yes.
And you do it a Bowie and not a Bowie?
It's a Bowie, yes, definitely Bowie, yes.
Bowie or Bowie?
Bowie.
Bowie.
But that's not what the Jim Bowie was called, or Jim Bowie was called in the Alamo. He was a Bowie.
No, but that's what I'm called, Kath Bowie.
Oh, right.
She's their own superstar.
You are your own superstar. You are indeed. Well, so we're led to believe, Kath, that there's nobody else like you, or very few people like you, but there is. There is lots of people your age, your stage, doing what you do.
Yes, there's not a lot that streams. Okay, Fortnite, but there's definitely plenty that plays. Any game, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be Fortnite. It can be any game.
So, Kath, how did you get started in all of this?
Oh, yeah, well, it's 7 years ago, actually. I walked into my teenage grandson's bedroom and just saw him playing what I now know, of course, and what I play is Fortnite. And that was the very first week that Epic had released it. And it was just really love at first sight.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Your time is 4:48 with me, Martin Daubney, here on GB News. Now, foreign nationals are an astonishing more than 3 times as likely to be arrested for sexual offences as British citizens. And the research conducted by the Centre for Migration Control also found that for all crime types, foreign nationals were arrested at twice the rate of native Brits. Let's get the thoughts now. The immigration barrister, Paul Turner. Paul, welcome to the show. And we have to say at the outset that facts aren't racist. Facts are facts. And these facts tell us, as clear as the nose on your face, foreign nationals arrested at 3.5 times the rate of Brits. They make up 26% of all sexual arrests in 2024. The League of Shame is Albania, Afghanistan, Iraq, Algeria and Somalia. But the point is, Paul Turner, this information from the Centre for Migration Control had to be forced out of the Home Office via Freedom of Information Acts, pieced together. This is precisely the kind of information the government don't want us to have. What are they afraid of?
I think they're afraid of the facts and what they say. And to be honest, when I read the article this morning, it was disappointing, but not surprising. And with what's going on in the news at the moment, and having been doing this for worked for about 25 years. The question as to whether culture actually comes into it has to sadly be raised and perhaps answered. I've had quite a lot of clients that come over and in fact wouldn't even hand money over to female members of staff because they consider that to be against their belief system. So there does seem to be from certain countries an attitude towards women which wouldn't normally be seen as a British attitude towards women. And perhaps this reflects itself in the crime figures that have been disclosed. It's also disturbing that people can come here and get visas for the United Kingdom, and they have to do a TB check to make sure they're not carrying an infectious disease, but they don't have to produce a DBS. So we could be having people coming from what are, dare I say it, backward countries or countries with a different approach to equality that have convictions being granted visas into the United Kingdom. And we simply don't know that we're getting the bad eggs. And I think that that's a large part of it. And I think that another part of it is that people that come here just sometimes don't assimilate or don't seem to adopt British values. And I think that this is a natural consequence of the UK being too permissive.
Paul Turner, what we have as a consequence are the thick end of 11,000 foreign nationals who are prisoners in Britain, and we're not deporting them. Albanians are the highest proportion of foreign nationals in British jails. We've got a returns deal with Albania. In theory, we're allowed to intercept Albanians who break our law and send them back, but that doesn't seem to extend to those who are already at His Majesty's pleasure. Surely there's a sound reason here, Paul Turner, to say if we've got a returns deal with Albania, we should take every single Albanian in a British jail and send them back to Albania.
Well, in theory, yes. The practical steps that lawyers would raise are that if the Home Office wishes to deport somebody, they would have to serve a number of decision letters on them and they would have a right of appeal. They are often offered an early return scheme whereby they can have quite a lot of time cut off their sentence. And another issue, and I come across this quite often, is individuals are sentenced to, say, a term of imprisonment of 3 years. They go home after a year and they're back in the United Kingdom often within as little as a week. So I understand that keeping 10,000 people in prison at £40,000 a year is a waste of money. But if we just remove them straight away, they're likely just to come straight back.
Do you think there's an argument to be made? For example, we say on the show all the time, we have the data in places like Denmark, in places like the Netherlands, in places like Germany, and the data shows us with total clarity there is a propensity to offend among nations that is very, very clear. The pattern is the same across continental Europe. Wherever you look, we see the same emergence, and yet there seems to be a state of denial about this, particularly in the United Kingdom. We seem to be sticking our head in the sand, the same way as we have with the grooming gangs, actually, with the rape gangs. And the longer this gets ignored, the more resentment there is from the public.
I think you're 100% right there, Martin. And I think that reflecting on it, when certain countries that are not subject to having a visa before you get on the plane, lots of people abuse the system. The government it makes people apply for visas before they come. If countries are producing more sex offenders than other countries, perhaps those countries or people coming from them need to show a DBS and they need to be able to show
Paul Turner, we have to leave it there. We've simply run out of time, and I just want to point out not everybody from these nations are criminals. Not everyone from these countries at all is backward. It's just a way of phrasing it there from Paul. Let's move on because we've got a comment from the Home Office we have to read out. It says this: foreign nationals who commit heinous crimes should be in no doubt that we will do everything to make sure that they are not free on Britain's streets, and that includes removal from the UK. Now, coming up, a brave dad from Rochdale speaks to GB News after his daughter was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. We'll also be joined by the phenomenal whistleblower Maggie Oliver. That's next with me, Martin Daubney, on Britain's News Channel. But here's your weather now.
A chilly start will give way to a lovely, warm afternoon. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Weather and flood warnings remain in place. The wintry weather will continue for most of this week. Further snow showers in places tonight. If you don't get the snow showers, then it's going to be cold and frosty and potentially icy. The low pressure system that brought all the snow over the weekend is now heading out into the North Sea, taking its wet weather with it. But behind it, the wind's coming down from the north, bringing snow showers across northern Scotland. A mixture of rain, sleet and snow showers for Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest. You could easily get a few more centimetres of snow in places here, but it's going to be quite patchy. Certainly close to the coast, mostly rain, but with temperatures tumbling, any showers could lead to things being very icy through the night and first thing on Tuesday morning. So a frosty old start for many central and eastern parts, dry, fine and sunny starts, and many places will stay that way through the day. But more snow showers will continue to come in across northern Scotland. Again, perhaps rain close to coast, but inland and certainly over any hills, there'll be more snow building up. Wintry mix across Northern Ireland, sleet, hail, some snow showers here. Same goes for Wales. Again, you could wake up to a covering, a further few centimetres in places, showers into the southwest, again potentially making things very slippery on those roads and pavements. During the day, we'll continue to see some showers into the west, some getting into northwest England, again chiefly of rain at low levels here, but many eastern and southern parts dry, fine and sunny. Still a cold wind blowing, but not quite as strong, quite as bitter as the winds have been today. But temperatures are still going to struggle below average, even in the sunny spell. 6 or 7 across the south at best. Many places not much above freezing. Another hard frost Tuesday night into Wednesday. And then for Wednesday, we need to keep our eyes on this weather system coming up from the south. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets, but if it hits the colder air, it could bring some significant snow across parts of the south. This is on Wednesday. Stay updated to the forecast.
A nice bright morning will generate a lovely warm day, right through to the evening. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm Jules Buckley. Still very slow traffic for the southbound M6 in Staffordshire. Now, between the Kiel services and Stoke at Junction 15, 2 lanes are coned off. There's a fuel spillage being cleaned up following an earlier collision, so we're seeing some big delays. Now, Warwickshire, the Warwick bypass, the A46, is closed both ways between the Birmingham Road, the A4177, and the M40 Junction 15. Investigation work continues, causing big queues in and out of Warwick itself. A few issues on the M25, so clockwise, firstly, after Junction 16, long delays following an earlier bump, all lanes open. Clockwise, part blocked before Lakeside at 30 and queuing. That's due to a collision. And the anti-clockwise side shut from 9 to 8. Leatherhead to Reigate, queuing before 9. That's due to emergency repairs. And that's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Imagine how £50,000 in cash from us could make your new year go with a bang. From treats to holidays to fun times with the family, a totally tax-free £50,000 in cash could make you feel alive in 2025. And just one entry into the Great British Giveaway really could make £50,000 cash all yours. For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. You can call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB10 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 31st of January. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
A very, very good afternoon to you. It's 5 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show here on GB News. We're broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK. On today's show, GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters interviews Marlon, a dad from Rochdale, for 2 years. His daughter Scarlett, then aged just 13, was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. Today, he echoes calls for a full national inquiry into Britain's shame. And coming up soon, I'll also talk to the peerless campaigner on child sexual exploitation, Maggie Oliver, for more reaction from her. And yet, earlier today, when questioned on the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs, Sir Keir Starmer assumed to brush this off as merely jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. Could this lack of empathy turn into a full-blown political crisis for our beleaguered Prime Minister? And Elon Musk has slammed Nigel Farage as not being up to the job of being Reform leader after Farage seemed to distance himself from Tommy Robinson. The decision has caused a backlash and could cost Farage millions. But has Nigel Farage done the right thing, or was this a political own goal? Welcome to the show. Always an absolute pleasure to have your company. It was an astonishing press conference earlier on when Sir Keir Starmer appeared to indicate that if you are asking for a political inquiry into the rape gangs in Britain, this was jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. People were astonished across the nation, including survivors of those rape gangs. And a father were about to interview Marlon Lowe, whose daughter Scarlett was trafficked, drugged, raped, abused for 2 years, kidnapped from him. He'd drive around the streets trying to find his daughter, trying to get justice for her. It's an incredible interview. It's heartbreaking. That's coming soon. Plus, straight after that, I'll be joined by Maggie Oliver, the phenomenal campaigner, for her take on the astonishing comments earlier on today from our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, and the ongoing demands for a full, transparent, public inquiry into rape gangs, Britain's shame. That's coming next. Get in touch with your thoughts, gbnews.com/your say. But now here's your headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you and good afternoon. The top stories. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced his resignation. Trudeau has faced growing pressure from inside his governing Liberal Party after a surge in support for the opposition Conservatives in the polls. The 53-year-old steps down after 9 years in office, and he says he'll step down as soon as his party choose a replacement for him. Trudeau says that although he's a fighter, the Parliament he's serving is paralysed under his leadership.
The Liberal Party of Canada is an important institution in the history of our great country and democracy. A new Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party will carry its values and ideals into that next election. I'm excited to see the process unfold in the months ahead. We were elected for the third time in 2021 to strengthen the economy post-pandemic and advance Canada's interests in a complicated world. And that is exactly the job that I and we will continue to do for Canadians.
In other news, the government has not set a deadline on implementing the recommendations of an inquiry into child sexual abuse, Number 10 has said, but insists ministers are making progress. The Prime Minister's defended his position as Director of Public Prosecutions, saying child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening, and it was something he had tackled head-on whilst in that role. The Prime Minister has also hit back at Elon Musk over his comments on X that claimed safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is an evil witch and deserved to be in jail. Sir Keir Starmer went on to accuse opposition politicians of amplifying what the far right is saying on child sexual abuse after failing to act for 14 long years. Liberal Democrats leader Sir Ed Davey says the US ambassador should be summoned over Elon Musk's online attacks.
Ambassador should make it clear, both to the current White House and the President-elect, that anyone who is working in a senior level in any American government needs to be very careful about how they comment on UK affairs, whether they're the richest man in the world or anyone else.
Commenting on criticism of Jess Phillips, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says Jess Phillips, Minister of Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, has dedicated her career to tackling sexual violence and abuse and to being a voice for victims and survivors of the most terrible crimes, including child sexual abuse. She goes on to say she has worked with whistleblowers and campaigned tirelessly for justice for those badly let down by endemic institutional failure. The Prime Minister has pledged to reduce NHS waiting lists, saying we need NHS reform from top to bottom. The Prime Minister has called for more convenience for patients and said that no institution is more important to the security of the country than the NHS. In a speech, he unveiled the government's plans to cut the list of patients waiting more than 18 weeks for NHS treatment in England by nearly 500,000 over the next year. Sir Keir Starmer also said more NHS hubs will be set up in community locations, and there will also be greater use of the private sector to help reduce hospital waiting lists in England. GB News' Will Hollis spoke to locals in Derby.
I have had experience like trying to get in for appointments to start with, because obviously there's such a waiting list.
There are a growing population and resources are short, so it's a rock and a hard place, isn't it? What do you spend the money on?
I've got cancer, so I'm extremely fortunate in the fact that I get extremely well looked after. Unfortunately, if I was going to A&E and other things, I could be there for 12 hours.
My other half is in there at the moment with stage 4 cancer, and they've been amazing.
In other news, Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service has declared a major incident as widespread flooding hits Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. The fire brigade has received more than 200 calls since this morning, with crews finding cars stuck in floodwater and evacuating residents from flooded homes. Around 17 people have been rescued so far. Weather warnings persisted across the country this morning as many commuters suffered travel disruption from severe weather. Major roads have been closed and railway lines blocked. Manchester Airport's runways were closed early this morning because of heavy snow, but have since reopened. This comes after most of the UK saw heavy snow or icy rainfall over the weekend, and even reaching the coldest night of the winter so far at minus 13.3 degrees. And a man has been charged with assisting former soldier Daniel Khalif after he escaped from prison. Khalif was found guilty of spying for Iran after a trial in November last year and admitted to escaping from HMP Wandsworth. Imran Chowdhury, a 25-year-old from North East London, has been charged with one count of assisting an escaped prisoner and will appear in court tomorrow. And those are the latest GB News headlines for now. More from me in half an hour.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now moving on to the story that's shaming Britain, and of course that's the ongoing scandal into Britain's rape gangs. Sir Keir Starmer today earlier appeared to brush off the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. But what do survivors and their family make of this situation? Well, GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters earlier on spoke to Marlon Lowe, a dad from Rochdale. For 2 years, his daughter Scarlett, then aged just 13, was kidnapped, drugged and abused by a Pakistani rape gang. Today, he echoes calls for a full national inquiry into Britain's shame. Let's take a look.
She was going missing all the time, which was definitely one of the red flags for me, which was very much out of character. And the police wouldn't recognise it as grooming. They recognised it as Scarlett being a problematic child. To the point that I had to really push social services to put her into care. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I couldn't keep her safe. And even when she went into care, so she went into care for 18 months on a full child protection order, they still wouldn't recognise that she was being groomed. Actually, in one meeting, the social worker told me I was a liar. Then the grooming was tenfold at 16. And it's not just about grooming. So a lot of people talk about CSE, child sexual exploitation, you always get a criminal element to it because the groomers will use them children as a business. So it's not just about sex, it's about county lines. They all come as one. So one of my arguments is child exploitation because it's both of them. And this is what were happening.
What was happening to Scarlett around this time then when she was 16? What sort of abuse was she enduring?
A lot of the details I found out afterwards, but I kind of knew because at this point she was going missing for weeks. What I found out afterwards was she was being trafficked. So she was being trafficked to Bury, Rochdale, Bradford. The last place, which is only just 2 years ago, she was trafficked to Rochdale. Not one has been prosecuted. The closest we have got was 3 individuals given a CALM, which is a child abduction warning notice.
If you could deliver a message now to Jess Phillips, Sir Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, all the other Labour ministers about the national grooming gang scandal, what would you say to them?
I've said this previously, I would beg them. I would get on my hands and knees and beg them to reconsider and to support myself and other families and survivors to open up a national public inquiry, because how many independent inquiries are we going to have? They're a waste of taxpayers' money.
Well, we can now speak with our national reporter, Charlie Peters, who sat down and spoke to Marlon West there. Charlie, isn't it astonishing that Marlon West tells the story of his daughter, Scarlett? She was kidnapped, drugged, given vodka, cocaine, bruised, beaten, raped for years. And then Marlon said there not one single person has ever been prosecuted. And then to hear him say he will beg for a full national inquiry, it's heartbreaking that a father who's been through so much is begging for an inquiry. And yet earlier on today, Charlie Peters, it appeared to be brushed off as the rhetoric of the far right.
Yes, and good afternoon, Martin. Good evening, because Marlon West can scarcely believe what Sir Keir Starmer said this morning when answering questions from Christopher Hope, our political editor, on the issue of this demand for a national public inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. When Sir Keir Starmer said that such calls would be amplifying or supporting the far right. There's also been a lobby briefing this evening with lobby journalists speaking to the Prime Minister's spokesperson when he's not been able to identify other areas where that might be considered to be promoting the far right. It's fair to say that the Prime Minister has got himself into a difficult situation with that statement. And that statement, I have to say, has not gone down well with the many survivors, campaigners, and indeed, as you've seen, their families that GB News is speaking to about this national atrocity. Many of them are urging for this national public inquiry because the independent inquiry to child sexual abuse has never looked into the grooming gang scandal properly. In 2022, when it published its findings, it only went to 6 areas for assessments on grooming gangs. Only one of them, Bristol, had any prior reports of the abuse gangs. As a channel, we've identified over 50 different towns and cities where this sort of abuse has taken place. Marlon's daughter, Scarlett, has been trafficked to many of those towns where no independent inquiry and investigation has taken place. There's been no independent investigation into Aylesbury, into Oxford, into Banbury, into St Helens, into Huddersfield, into Bradford, into Birmingham, Wolverhampton, so many other towns I could list where we've seen credible reports of grooming gangs, but there just hasn't been that investigation. I'm in Greater Manchester this evening, and just up the road from me in Oldham, there were reports last week that we revealed that Jess Phillips had denied a public inquiry into the grooming gang scandal there. There was a local review in 2022, but it barely spoke to any survivors. Its terms of reference were just for 3 years. Survivors have been fighting and demanding for an independent government-led inquiry for years. They finally got that approval from the council, but the government have turned them down. Lots of anger from survivors, lots of demands for public inquiries, but Keir Starmer, it seems, is resisting those calls and saying that those calling for that inquiry potentially amplifying the far right.
Charlie Peters, an astonishing report. Once again, you're doing God's work. Thank you so much for what you're doing for the channel and for the survivors. And for more reaction now, let's speak to the former Greater Manchester police detective, the peerless campaigner, Maggie Oliver. Maggie, welcome to the show. How do you feel when you see the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, today seemingly brushing off demands for a full, transparent, apolitical inquiry as amplifying the message of the far right?
Hi, Martin. It won't surprise you that I am incandescent with rage. I am no far-right activist. I am a woman who gave 16 years of my life to the police, and protecting children was #1 priority in my life. I know Marlon very well, nor is he a far-right extremist. All the victims that I know and that we support are victims who have had their lives destroyed. To write them off as far-right extremists is insulting in the extreme, and it's another indication of how it's deflecting from the issues. It's trying to take the debate around from the real problem. And Marlon is quite right. The ICSA National Abuse Inquiry looked at many areas. 2 weeks was given to the organised networks. And I was one of the non-institutional core participants. I did a 50-page statement that was decimated to 18 pages. I was not allowed to give evidence. Many other non-institutional people who were witnesses were also denied that opportunity. There was one victim given a paltry 2 hours. The rest of that time was given to those in positions of influence, senior police officers, social workers, council leaders, all of whom were actually responsible for us being in this position in the first place. So it was a great missed opportunity. And I was devastated back then because I put faith in Alexis Jay because she knew Rotherham. I don't know who was pulling her strings, whether she was being prevented from looking at the towns and cities where this had happened. Charlie is absolutely right. You know, Rochdale, Rotherham, Telford, Oxford, Huddersfield, none of those towns were part of this review. The other thing to remember is that and the ICSA inquiry did highlight this, that absolutely there is no data collected about the ethnicity of the offenders. I would say that is a deliberate attempt to muddy the waters. And local inquiries don't work. Recommendations fall by the wayside. In fact, the Augusta review and the Rochdale review, I would say, were very good, very complete reports that uncovered an awful lot of the failures. But the mainstream media in London barely referred to them. This is a national problem, and we need to elevate it onto a national basis. In relation to Oldham, I would say that report in Oldham was a complete whitewash. There was one victim that was finally allowed to have her voice heard. And the only reason for that was because she came directly to me just before the report was due to be published and said, you know, I've never been approached. Oldham Council had told the review team that they must not under any circumstances approach her because she was suicidal. That was a lie. I don't know what was said about other victims, but I do not trust Oldham Council as far as I can throw them. And I feel that if we are going to go down the road of a national inquiry, the question isn't are we going to have one? It's who's going to lead it? What are the terms of reference? Are victims going to be front and centre of that inquiry? Are people like me, like the Centre for Women's Justice, like Marlon, like Parents Against Child Exploitation, are they going to be given free rein to speak the truth? Because without that, it's another pointless exercise in a cover-up. But we are not far-right extremists. We are ordinary people who see children being abused on an industrial scale without understanding the reasons and addressing those. We're never going to see the changes that we need, Martin.
Maggie, when I hear evidence like I had to read today, I mean, it's so harrowing to the point it's just, it can make you cry. And it often does, and no doubt it does you too. When you hear about Scarlett West, who was 13, 14 years of age, who was kidnapped, drugged, given cocaine, given vodka, bruised, beaten, had no recollection of the sexual crimes that have been committed to her. And yet not a single person has ever been prosecuted for those grotesque crimes that happened to her child. When you hear that added to what you've just said, do you have any faith that anybody in political life, in the police, in councils, in social services can be trusted? And you, the other day, made the front page of the Daily Mail when you said you think the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is as equal to blame in this.
I do not trust any of them. I would like to have been proved wrong on several occasions. Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions, Martin, when the Rochdale case was ongoing. He would have been entirely aware, if not responsible, for the charging decisions made on that. And when we have, a 13-year-old girl that was made pregnant by a 40-odd-year-old man, where we had a fetus and we had DNA, the decision to charge that man only with sexual activity with a child and trafficking is abhorrent in the extreme. That is the head of the CPS, the Director of Public Prosecutions. So I feel, I know that he could have done more. Other offenders on that case were given a slap on the wrist, basically. So I think now he is conveniently forgetting those things. He's also forgetting that he also directed police forces not to investigate these crimes. So I lay a great deal of responsibility at his door, hence why I have great difficulty in trusting that now he has changed his outlook and really wants to get to the truth, especially when I hear him in recent weeks making public statements about, the Muslim community being safe. I want everybody to be safe. But a child abuser, whether they are a priest in the church, whether they work in a football team or in a school, we deal with the abuse. We deal with the rape. And where the abusers come from, that is the issue. We do not protect child abusers. And I fear that in this particular kind of child abuse, it is riddled with people who avoid the reality that most of the abusers in these gangs are Pakistani Muslim men or Muslims from perhaps Afghanistan. But because we don't collect data, nobody really knows. The only thing we can see is the pictures of the abusers in the outcomes of the trials. And it's very clear the makeup of the abusers in these kinds of cases. And we really, really need to get a grip.
Maggie, can I ask you a question briefly? Do you fear that those in charge of the country are afraid of a full national transparent inquiry because it could bring down the entire establishment?
I think that underpins everything, as well as the class aspect, that the children who have been cannon fodder for these gangs are really from working class backgrounds, difficult backgrounds, and there is an elitism about politics today. Many of the politicians are not driven by their beliefs, they are career politicians. And to be fair, Martin, even when there are good people in politics, and there are, people like Sarah Champion, and actually Jess Phillips, I think she's getting a hard time because this is not been on her watch. She has just come into office and she has done a lot of good work with violence against women and girls. But when they do speak out, Sarah Champion lost her job. They are frightened and they are actually controlled by a party whip. That's the problem. They are not allowed to speak freely. And unless we have complete transparency and honesty, we're not going to be able to resolve this without truth, honesty, this duty of candour I keep hearing about, but I don't see it when we're looking at grooming gang rapes.
OK. May Oliver, thank you so much once again for your amazing work and your candidness and your honesty, and thank you just for being on the show. Thank you. Now, in the last few moments, the government spokesperson has said this in response to GB News' exclusive. The abuse that Mr West's daughter endured was unimaginable and something that no child should ever have to suffer. The minister met with Mr West to assure him that she will do everything within her power to protect vulnerable children and bring those who are responsible to justice. The Minister has been working across government to drive forward work to implement the recommendations of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and we fully support an independent inquiry or investigation by Oldham Council. This is entirely in line with the approach of the previous government and follows the example of local reviews in Telford and Rotherham. Still to come, we'll be crossing the line to the House of Commons, where Home Secretary Yvette Cooper is expected to make an emergency statement on grooming gangs on that scandal. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's News Channel.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Whether it's breaking royal news, Will, please bring us up to date, or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons.
Very, very curious.
We bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Christmas canapé offers partygoers a small treat that staves off hunger and soaks up the fizz. Founder and host of Crazy Sexy Food, Hannah Harley-Young, joins me now with a toothsome selection. Lovely to see you, Hannah.
You too.
Origin of the word canapé?
Yes, French. Sort of from the, of course, from sort of the 1800s. It means sofa. So it's sort of playing on the analogy of someone sitting or lying on a sofa. It is about the garnish, traditionally sitting on a piece of stale bread or pastry. Obviously, it's evolved over the years. I don't have any stale bread for you, don't worry. But the idea is that it's something sort of garnish, something exciting sitting on a vehicle that you can put in your mouth in 1 or 2 bites.
It's obviously post-war. What is it? Is it 60s or 70s? How long have we been eating these things?
I would say around about then. And I think what's interesting, I mean, I always look towards even the 80s, a little bit sort of... later on, where it's where you sort of have that sort of the classic vol au vent, which was, you know, a little bit dry, a little bit tasteless, and I think that's why I've brought a real selection for you to show you how far we've come. Another traditional one, obviously, being your pigs in blankets. I'm going to hold off for a second before I choke. Another thing that I have to say about canapés, there are a few little tips that I must give people super quickly. Make sure they're small. 1 or 2 bites. When you're at a party, you're standing, you've got a glass in one hand, then you need to hold it. There. OK, I would have preferred a glass of wine, but, you know, I can't stand these canapés where I have to put the glass down in order to eat the food. I want to do it all at once.
I couldn't agree more. You should never eat more than you can lift.
Exactly.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent? I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Your time is 5:28 with me, Martin Daubney. Now, sing hosannas because the queen of primetime political debate shows, Michelle Dewberry, is back. Michelle, your first show of the year. Wow, your country and your channel really, really need you at the moment. Tell us about your thoughts on this astonishing situation on the ongoing grooming scandal.
Well, it's absolutely appalling what's been going on. And, of course, Keir Starmer essentially labelling many people that want an inquiry as being far right. Many people are trying to say, well, hold on a minute, that's not what he said, that's not the context. But the problem is Keir Starmer now has sown these seeds now by calling so many different things far right. And I think, Martin, we should just cut to the chase now, and Keir Starmer should just come out and tell us if there are any legitimate people's concerns that he doesn't think are far right. That would save us all so much time, wouldn't it? Because apparently, according to him, pretty much so much of our concerns now are. It just gets that word now. It's become so used like confetti. It's almost meaningless now anyway. But for me, Martin, the thing that's key in this whole kind of grooming gang situation, they're not grooming gangs, they're rape, torture gangs as well. I want to hear from one of the survivors, one of the victims of this. So many people desperately trying to outdo each other with who's spoken about this fastest and earliest and so on and so forth. the girls at the heart of this, that's who I'm interested to hear from. And also a robust debate, as Jubes & Co is known for. Ben Habib will be alongside me tonight, so we've got plenty to get our teeth into.
Jubes go 6 till 7. As I said, your country is so glad to have you back. Michelle Dewberry, always a pleasure and a very, very happy new year. Now, moving on to the story that's shaming Britain. That is, of course, that ongoing scandal into grooming gangs. Sir Keir Starmer brushed off, it has seemed, the need for a full public inquiry into these rape gangs earlier on as jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. To discuss that further, I'm now joined in the studio by GB News' political editor, Chris Hope. Chris, you were at that press conference earlier on. A lot of jaws just hit the floor. It appeared that the Prime Minister brushed this off as pandering to the far right. You were there. What's your take?
Well, that's what he appeared to do, certainly in his response. We asked him about, we put the figures that Charlie Peters has drawn out, 6 towns mentioned in the Baroness J review out in 2022, but we think there's 50 in total, so 44 not talked about, not investigated, no national plan here. He's moving quite quickly politically on this. We've got Kenny Badenoch saying that the Tory party will look to amend the Children's Wellbeing Bill on Wednesday. That's if it's accepted by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. That will force Labour MPs, SNP MPs, Lib Dem MPs to vote for or against a national inquiry. Question marks on whether it will actually have any bearing on the government, but certainly it's very embarrassing and will become a problem possibly at the election next, when they could come to have a next general election. For Number 10's point of view, they are saying tonight, to a briefing I've been at just now, that the Alexis J report, all 20 recommendations will be implemented. They will not give us a timescale. They're saying they're moving as quickly as possible. On the issue of the far right, we are now told by Number 10 that he wasn't calling anyone wanting an inquiry far right. He was criticising politicians jumping on the far-right bandwagon. So he's having a go at people like, although they wouldn't confirm names in Downing Street, but maybe Robert Jenrick, for example, Kenny Badenoch, but not the victims who so bravely have spoken to the channel today.
But those politicians, if they're far-right, that's entirely seems absurd anyway. But they're asking for the same things as people like Maggie Oliver, as the same things as survivors like Marlon West, the same thing as survivors who spoke to Charlie Peters today. You can't say that it only applies to the politicians if they're simply asking for the same thing as those who've had their lives ripped apart by this. And isn't this another example of the Prime Minister talking himself into a corner about the far right? It seems to be everything is far right if Sir Keir Starmer doesn't agree with it.
It allows them not to address the point of contention. Now, we saw this during those riots in August, where everyone condemned the violence, the behaviour, the tweets. That was all condemned. But there was a concern about immigration and housing migrants in hostels, hotels, in areas, and no consultation. That's where the frustration came from. But we're trying to say then, or we're reporting, was what others were saying, that it's not far right to be concerned. Equally with this issue here, it is difficult, but because it's difficult, it hasn't been addressed for well over a decade, and that's why I think it's bubbling up now.
And worse than that, actually, now the reason this conversation has been suppressed and dampened down and branded as racist and Islamophobic and far right, those are the tools of control of this conversation. That's what's meant that we haven't got to resolution for thousands and thousands of girls who've had their lives utterly ripped apart. And in fact, I think we're waiting for the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, perhaps, to address the Commons on this point. We're going to cross there live in a moment. But Chris, I'll bring you back to that point. It's like this trope of the far right, of racist Islamophobia. That's what got us into this mess. That's what made council after council, police force after police force, politician after politician bury their head in the sand. We can't carry on with this rhetoric.
That's right. You go back to what Maggie Oliver was telling you just 10 minutes ago. It's not far right to be concerned about these issues. Charlie Peters, who's now reporting from North West England for GB News, he says a survivor from Rotherham has told him the victims all over deserve to know the true extent of why we were abused and who covered it up. It's so easy, they say, to keep blaming the far right every single time it comes up. They want to know the truth across the country. And I think by saying the far right, using that, it's a way of avoiding the issue here. Why is it that there were 6 towns were mentioned in the J report? 50 we have found through court reporting, court accounts. We think that they happened in 50 towns in total, 44 more than were touched on in the J report. That's why the joining the dots matters so much in a national inquiry, and that's why this pressure will grow through this week into what could be if the Speaker allows it, we won't know until lunchtime on Wednesday, a big vote on Wednesday.
And just to remind you, we are waiting to cross the line to Parliament. We're expecting a statement from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. I think, do we have that graphic of that map? You referred to that earlier on. I think it's a really, really important point, and that is the official report in the Pastor J report referred to 6 towns. And Chris Hope, talk us through here. We have 50 towns. Clearly, 44 of them didn't even get a mention.
Across the country, north and south, east and west. So when I say joining the dots, I mean joining those towns and understanding what was happening. Was there kind of any controlling mind? And probably wasn't, given it sounds like quite local people purporting to do this activity. But that's what we mean by joining the dots. Look at lessons learned. And also, I think, if there were an inquiry, it would allow space to talk about it without being accused of being racist, discussing it, because that is so important.
Here's a big point, and here's one I put to Maggie Oliver earlier on. If they wanted to get rid of any accusations of a cover-up, if they wanted to get rid of any accusations that perhaps Labour councillors, perhaps police forces had a bias, were covering up, then they would throw the doors open. Surely, logic dictates to a full, transparent national inquiry. But what if, Chris Hope, what if that full inquiry identified so many people who are complicit, perhaps even going as high as the Director of Public Prosecutions himself, Sir Keir Starmer? And you mentioned this earlier on. Could this be a scandal that could tear the entire establishment apart?
Well, I don't have the clip from the question earlier with the Prime Minister in a hospital in Epsom in Surrey, but certainly, I mean, he would say, and he did say to us, didn't he, that child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening. He said he tackled the issue head on. He opened the first Rochdale prosecution, he said. But the question I asked him was, is it the case that the DPP at the time will it expose wrongdoings, failings within your department? The J report, which came out, by the way, on the same day which Liz Truss resigned. The reason why it hasn't had a lot of conversation, as it should do, in Westminster is that the government failed that day, late in the afternoon. So I think that's why it hasn't really properly been discussed. 20 recommendations there, but the issue of these grooming gangs was only one part of a whole piece across all of British society, and that's why I think many are saying, the victims are saying it, the Tories, Reform UK are saying it, there should be a separate inquiry for its part. The government is saying it will implement J review as quickly as possible, and another review won't help anything. Let's get to grips with the issues these victims are facing.
I wonder if we can try and pull that clip earlier on of when Chris Hope interviewed Sir Keir Starmer. Let's try and get that ready. But in the meantime, there has been some political reaction. And again, Nigel Farage was echoing there what Maggie Oliver said to me a moment ago, and indeed what Marlon Lowe said earlier on to Marlon West, who said to Charlie Peters his daughter had been abused for years. And that is, Nigel Farage said, the inquiries so far have been a whitewash. So there seems to be little faith in the inquiries so far. And so why not? Have we got that clip by Chris Hope? Let's try and throw it to that now. We don't have it. So keep going. That's the point, isn't it? The inquiries so far have been a whitewash, so you can't keep saying, well, we had inquiries, we've done it all before. And no one's got faith in them.
James Cleverly, the former Home Secretary, he's saying on Twitter right now, on X, when will Starmer and Labour learn? Accusing those who disagree with him or who seeks legitimate answers about repeated failures of child protection as far right is deeply insulting and counterproductive. James Cleverly says it is the best recruiting sergeant for extremism. I think now we're going to the House, where we're expecting a statement here on this scandal.
No, this is the build-up to that. In the meantime, Chris, you were saying there, Robert Jenrick, James Cleverly making political hay. As you'd expect, Kemi Badenoch trying to force this amendment through on Wednesday. I mean, there's
a lot on them. I mean, this government, these politicians were in power for 14 years, Martin. The J happened, and then for 2 years, the government did nothing about it. OK, they had their own dramas with Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, but they didn't do it. OK, so it's definitely on the Tories, but equally it's now on Labour's in charge right now, and it's them to answer these questions. But no question, and the frustration might be in Downing Street that it's being pushed hard politically by the Tories. But what were they doing for 14 years?
Well, the answer
not enough,
is not a lot. And this is a point made by Maggie Oliver. And isn't that the point, though? Successive governments now have buried their heads in the sand on this or dragged their heels on this. And it's all fine and well for Kemi Badenoch to now to stand up and say, we want action. But 14 years in power, far there was inaction. There was a wall of silence, and it hasn't happened. And now the political blame game really doesn't do anybody any favours.
And no one is served by it. I mean, I'm just looking back at the reports now, this lobby briefing that's been to. The PM spokesman, he doesn't think calling for an inquiry is far right, but by opposition MPs doing so, they're amplifying the far right.
What does that even mean? They just tie themselves in
about
knots.
what is amplifying the far right. There was no answer. I think there's a concern that politics is being played here by people around the Prime Minister, clearly, but just calling for an inquiry isn't necessarily a far-right thing to do. And what is so frustrating we're seeing in our inbox and on social media and elsewhere from viewers and listeners of GB News, that is not a far-right activity to want to get to the bottom of this and do the right by these poor girls who are so badly mistreated.
Maybe the opposite of far right is to be far wrong. Are they far wrong to say, no, we don't need an inquiry, we'll leave it down to local authorities? People like Maggie Oliver, people like Marlon West have told GB News today they've got no faith whatsoever in local authorities' ability to conduct authorities, to inquiries, to mark their own homework. We saw in Oldham, a child safeguarding officer was the ringleader of a rape gang in another town. He was on the payroll at Oldham Council. Is there any wonder people have no faith in local authorities' ability to investigate themselves?
Well, they're hiding behind the J report. Again, 20 recommendations in 2022. They won't say when any of these will be implemented. We asked for a deadline by the election. No answer was forthcoming. They are setting deadlines for other parts of government, notably the NHS, and cutting waiting times. They are not doing so with this. In all of government, I've been around this for 30 years covering this. I know that Whitehall responds to deadlines. Unless you give a deadline to a Whitehall civil servants, they won't deal with it properly. But the Telegraph reporting right now, this moment, child groomers to get longer prison sentences under a crackdown that's by the Home Secretary coming up. So they're going to try and treat grooming as a statutory aggravating factor when judges sentence offenders for specified child sex offences, including rape and assault. Currently, is not an aggravating factor.
What took them so long? Seriously, Chris Hope, you've got people like Marlon West saying that for years his daughter was kidnapped, drugged, force-fed alcohol, cocaine, sexually abused, raped, trafficked from town to town to town, from Bury, Bradford, Rochdale, in Airbnbs, Pakistani gangs of men, much, much older than her, caught in car parks with much older men, a 13-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl. The police let them off. Not a single person has ever been prosecuted in the case of the systemic rape of a 14-year-old girl, Scarlett West. Why on earth should suddenly they decide they should be prosecuted and we have any faith in anything they say?
Again, and also with the Tories, by all that happened on the Tory watch, nothing happened. Now Labour in charge, we're seeing slowly some activity possibly. Number 10 say they are clear. The PM wants action. He wants justice for victims of child sexual abuse. His point is that the way they get their action, that action is to take action, not to have another inquiry, which allows ministers to park things in a 3-year inquiry. So he's got a point on that, I think. Get on with it. Activity. But what I think is being missed, as we've identified this morning through Charlie Peters' reporting, there are 44 towns, we think, who have not had an inquiry, have not been mentioned by anyone nationally. Is there anything to link behaviours here that will allow some guidance to go to all councils on how to tackle this issue? By keeping it local, the risk is it serves the perpetrators.
I wonder if this is just muddying the waters. Now, we don't need new laws. We have existing laws on kidnap, on rape, on paedophilia. You know, this exists. There's been a reluctance to implement existing law, and we know the reasons why, because they've been terrified of being accused of being racist, of being Islamophobic. We don't need a new law. We need the guts to implement the laws we've already got.
Indeed, and looking at the screen now, Martin, it looks like the changeover now we should be seeing the Home Secretary or a member of her team in the Home Office speaking shortly, answering this question. And here we go, I think, right now.
I have a statement to make on behalf of the Speaker. Before I call the Home Secretary to make a statement, I should like to remind members of the House, subject to this resolution, which prohibits reference being made to any active criminal cases. Members should not therefore make any reference to any active case in which an individual has already been charged. I call the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sexual abuse and exploitation are the most vile and horrific of crimes, involving rape, violence, coercive control, intimidation, manipulation and deep long-term harm. The information from the crime survey should be chilling to all of us. It estimates that 500,000 children every year experience some form of child sexual abuse, violence and sexual violation in the home, repeated rapes or exploitation by grooming or paedophile gangs, threats and intimidation involving intimate images online, abuse within institutions that should have protected and cared for young people, cruel and sadistic crimes against those who are most vulnerable. All of us have a responsibility to protect our children. Perpetrators must be punished and pursued. Victims and survivors must be protected and supported. But these crimes have not been taken seriously for too long, and far too many children have been failed. That is why this government is determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, supporting stronger police action and protection for victims. There is no excuse for anyone not to take these crimes seriously. Brave survivors speaking out have shone a light on terrible crimes and the failure of institutions to act, be it in care homes in Rochdale, Asian grooming gangs in Rotherham or Telford, abuse that was covered up within faith institutions, including the Church of England and Catholic Church, or within family homes. And that report, alongside other appalling crimes coming to light, is why, in opposition, our party called for a national independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and supported that work when it was launched by the previous government. Over 7 years, that inquiry, expertly led by Professor Alexis Jay, engaged with more than 7,000 victims and survivors, processed 2 million pages of evidence, and published 61 reports and publications. Its findings should be truly disturbing for everyone, describing the pain and suffering caused to victims and survivors, the deviousness and cruelty of perpetrators. Nor is there any excuse for anyone not to recognise and act on the deep harm and damage from organised gang exploitation, abuse, sexual assaults and rape. 10 years ago, 2 reports by Alexis Jay and Louise Casey in Rotherham found that 1,400 children were sexually exploited, raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked across other towns, abducted, beaten, threatened with guns, even children who had been doused in petrol, girls as young as 11 who were raped. And their reports identified then, a decade ago, a failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs and, quote, a widespread perception that they should downplay the ethnic dimensions for fear of being seen to be racist. When those reports came out, those failings in Rotherham were condemned across the board by both government and opposition in this House. As I said at the time, it is never an excuse to use race and ethnicity or community relations as an excuse not to investigate and punish sex offenders. And the then Home Secretary made clear cultural concerns and fear of being seen as racist must never stand in the way of child protection. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse also ran a specific investigation strand into child sexual exploitation by organised networks. It ran for 2 years and produced a separate report in February 2022, which concluded that police forces and local councils were still failing to tackle this serious crime and set out further recommendations for change. But Madam Deputy Speaker, despite these different inquiries drawing up multiple recommendations, far too little has actually been done. None of the 20 recommendations from the independent inquiry into child abuse have been implemented. As the Act Act on Independent Child Abuse Campaign Group from the Survivors Trust has said this week, victims of child sexual abuse cannot afford further delays in meaningful action. And they said it is now imperative to keep the focus on radical reform. Yep. Two different Conservative Home Secretaries said after the report was published it was a watershed, should be the beginning of a new chapter for change, but that has not happened. We now need new impetus and action. Since coming into office, the Safeguarding Minister has met with Professor Alexis Jay and survivors and convened the first dedicated cross-government group to drive forward change and to ensure that victims' voices remain at the very heart of this process. I can tell the House that we will set up a new victims and survivors panel to work on an ongoing basis with the interministerial group to guide them on the design, delivery and implementation of new proposals and plans, not just on the ICSA inquiry, but on wider work around child sexual exploitation and abuse. And we will set out more details and timescales based on that work. But before that, I can announce action on three key recommendations. First, I can confirm we will make it mandatory to report abuse, and we will put the measures in the Crime and Policing Bill that will be put before Parliament this spring, making it an offence with professional and criminal sanctions to fail to report or cover up child sexual abuse. Yeah. The protection of institutions must never be put before the protection of children. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, this measure is something I first called for in response to the reports and failings in Rotherham 10 years ago. It's something that the Prime Minister first called for 12 years ago, based on his experience as Director for Public Prosecutions. And the case was clear then, but we've lost a decade and we need to get on with it now. Second, we'll also legislate to make grooming an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offences, because the punishment must fit the terrible crime. And third, we will overhaul the information and evidence that is gathered on child sexual abuse and exploitation and embed it in a clear new performance framework for policing, so these crimes are taken far more seriously. The independent inquiry recommended as one of its first recommendations a single core data set on child abuse and protection, but that's never been done. We'll introduce a single child identifier in the Children and Wellbeing Bill and a much stronger police performance framework, including new standards on public protection, child abuse and exploitation. We're accelerating the work of the Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force, set up rightly under the previous government, and there has been a 25% increase in arrests between July and September of this year. That sits alongside the Tackling Organised Exploitation programme, which is using advanced data and analytics to uncover the complex networks. The data on ethnicity is now being published, but we will work further with them to improve the accuracy and robustness of the data and analysis. And we will continue to support further investigations that are needed, including police investigations and local independent inquiries and reviews which can expose failings and wrongdoing in local areas and institutions, as we've seen in Telford, in Rotherham and Greater Manchester. We support the ongoing work commissioned by Mayor Andy Burnham into historic abuse in Oldham, which has led to new police investigations, arrests and convictions. And to build on those findings, the leader of Oldham Council has confirmed this week work to set up a further local independent inquiry is already underway, including liaison with Oldham survivors. We welcome and support this work, which will put victims' voices at its heart. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Telford inquiry was particularly effective because it involved victims in shaping the inquiry, and they were involved at every stage. So Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has now agreed to work with the government and with other local councils where stronger engagement with victims or survivors is needed, or where more formal inquiries are required to tackle persistent problems. But we should also be clear. Wherever there have been failings or that perpetrators of terrible crimes have not been brought to justice, the most important inquiries and investigations should be police investigations to track those perpetrators down, to bring them before the courts and to get the victims the protection that they deserve. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to face the serious challenge that the fastest growing area of grooming and child abuse is now online. So we will also take much stronger action to crack down on rapidly evolving forms of child sexual exploitation and abuse and grooming online, including to tackle the exponential rise in AI-facilitated child sexual abuse material. And we will set out a significant package of measures to strengthen the law in this area in the coming weeks. For many years, there has been broad cross-party consensus, not only on the importance of this work, but that the interests of victims and survivors must come first. There will be different views about the details of the policies that are needed, but every one of us across this House has supported action to protect our children, and that is all our responsibility to keep them safe for the future. So I hope that members across the House will work with ministers and with the victims and survivors panel that we are setting up to change protection for the better and to make sure it is perpetrators who pay the price. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. The whole country is shocked by the rape gang scandal. Over years or decades, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of vulnerable young girls were systematically raped by organised gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Instead of those victims being protected and the perpetrators prosecuted, those girls were systematically failed. Many cases were covered up because of absurd concerns about so-called community relations. Police often did not investigate. Local councils covered things up. The Crown Prosecution Service frequently failed victims. And those raising concerns were frequently accused of racism. Never again can people be silenced in that way. And I pay tribute to people who have raised these cases over the years, starting, I think, with former Labour MP Anne Cryer, nearly 2 decades ago, who first raised these problems and bravely persevered, despite accusations of racism and worse, including from her very own colleagues. And let me just say, in that vein, a word on the Prime Minister's comments this morning. It is not far right to stand up for victims of mass rape. And smearing people.
Order.
Is those concerns.
Shadows. People want to hear the statement. Chris Phil.
Smearing people who raise those issues is exactly how this ended up getting covered up in the first place. Now, I will, of course, repeat now what I said yesterday, that intimidation and threats towards elected members of Parliament and ministers, including the member for Birmingham Yardley, are completely wrong. Now, as the Home Secretary said, action is important, and the last government took extensive action, starting with the original Jay report commissioned in 2014 by previous Home Secretary, now Baroness May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and it was Sajid Javid who commissioned data collection in about 2018. Now, in relation to the response to the ICSA report published in 2022, it is not true to say the last government took no action. The last government established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, whose work led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year and safeguarded 4,500 victims. So my first question to the Home Secretary is this: can she confirm to the House, I'm sure she can, but can she confirm to the House that the Grooming Gangs Task Force work will continue and I hope even be stepped up? Secondly, as part of the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force, and again implementing one of the recommendations of the ICSA report, in April 2023, the last government mandated data collection in relation to ethnicity that the Home Secretary also referred to. Will she confirm? Now it's been going for over a year and a half. Will the Home Secretary now confirm that data on the ethnicity of perpetrators will be published? Now, as the Home Secretary, of course, has acknowledged, one of ICSA's main recommendations was mandatory reporting to the police by people in positions of responsibility. Now, the last government was in the process of implementing that recommendation via a measure in the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell with the early election. Now, I'm glad to hear the Home Secretary has just announced that she will continue with the last government's proposals in her forthcoming bill, and she can be assured that the opposition will support the government in the continuation of that measure. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary did not address the need for a full national public inquiry on this scandal. Now, while the last government did initiate the ICSA inquiry under Professor Jay, that was mainly directed at other child sexual abuse and exploitation issues, and it only covered 6 of the towns involved in the gang rape scandal. So it didn't cover everything. We do need to get to the truth. We now have evidence, new evidence of further that is of interest to the public, including what Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, said about the way he was pressured into staying silent. We have evidence about local authorities covering this up. We have the 3rd report last year on Operation Span, commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, exposing failings by the Crown Prosecution Service, which are extremely serious. This all needs to be looked into, so will the Home Secretary commission that national statutory public inquiry which can compel witnesses to attend, that can requisition evidence, and where it can take evidence under oath. And if the government will not order that statutory national public inquiry, we will table an amendment to the Children Wellbeing Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote. And I hope members across the House will vote for that full statutory public inquiry so we can get to the truth.
Home Secretary.
But just to say to the Shadow Home Secretary, this is an issue in which, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, when I was the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I worked with government ministers on, and in which there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these very serious and vile crimes. These are the most appalling crimes against children. The brutal rape, the repeated multiple rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling of circumstances, and the abuse of trust for those children. Often it be people who should have protected them, who should have looked after them, and where institutions failed to keep them safe. That's why the independent inquiry was so important. It's why I called for it. It's why many other people in this House, across this House, called for it, and it's why we supported it when the previous government set it up. But the truth is, there just has not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There hasn't been enough change to policies, to the way in which services operate at local level. And that is a deep failing, that those changes have not taken place. He used the example of the duty to report. This is incredibly important because it is about preventing any chance of people turning a blind eye, of professionals turning a blind eye to abuse, of people covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It's about making it a criminal offence. And yet we called for it 10 years ago. He had a decade in order to introduce that, a decade that we have now lost without having those powers and those measures in place. He rightly talks about the task force. I mentioned that in my response, and we've supported not just continuing with that task force, but actually accelerating its work. So it has increased. The last quarter of arrests have increased on the previous quarter, a significant increase in arrests, because the thing I want to see most of all is I want to see perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for the vile crimes against children. And in order to do that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country in order to do this. So yes, we will accelerate the work of the task force. But he refers to the ethnicity data.
It's already been published. It was published in November. The latest report was published in November as a result of the work of the task force. I would just say to him, though, I don't think that the data that they have gathered actually is adequate. I don't think it goes far enough. I think there's a real problem with the way in which we collect data, and police forces collect data. It's very haphazard. There isn't a proper system for collecting data, for having proper performance framework for policing, because, again, to be honest, I think his government withdrew too far from policing and having the kind of standards we need to have in place. I hope we can work together on having a stronger performance framework, having a clearer framework of data, including dealing with these issues around ethnicity. And the issue back in 2015, we had the consensus on the need to make sure that race and ethnicity are never used as an excuse not to tackle crime, that somehow the fact that vulnerable girls supposedly consented when they did not is used as an excuse not to tackle crime. We can never accept those excuses. I hope that we will have agreement between us on how we do that. And in terms of inquiries, I would just say to him, his party launched the child abuse inquiry. They set the terms of reference. They provided the substantial funding for it. And he could have raised concerns about its terms of reference, about the scope of it, about the extent of its reports at any point, including at any point since it reported, and he didn't do so until last week. I hope he will support now the work that Oldham is determined to take forward, the work that we can hopefully see replicated from Telford. The Telford inquiry was a really important one. And I hope, too, that he is prepared to work with the Victims and Survivors panel, which will help us take forward exactly the kinds of further investigations, reviews and inquiries that should take place both at local level and across the country in order to make sure we protect child victims.
Select Committee Chair Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. Child sexual exploitation and abuse is a heinous crime. It happens everywhere, in all communities, in all settings, and we must all be vigilant and do what we can to address that. My right honourable friend mentioned the importance of ensuring that victims of CSA are at the heart of all that we do, and I support it wholeheartedly with that. And if it is the will of these victims of abuse in Oldham to have an additional review of the circumstances which led to their abuse, then I will also be wholeheartedly supporting that. But can my right honourable friend expand on how we can transparently track progress with the completion dates set for the recommendations? It can't be allowed that we have the detailed recommendations from a national independent inquiry and 3 years later we're still waiting for them to be implemented.
My honourable friend makes a really important point. I know she has worked immensely hard.
Well, there you go. Our